it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Part 1. I crouched down and shone my torch into the victim's wounds. Large amounts of her hair strands were found around the body in the bed, suggesting the victim's hair had been pulled violently. Most likely that she was sexually assaulted. Her hands and feet were tied together as she laid in what we call the hog roast position. The only thing missing was an apple in her mouth. The forensic investigator who freelances as a photographer took a Polaroid of each notable finding as I was around the room. The next thing I noticed was the blood seeping from Mrs. DeVille's ear, most likely from an internal skull fracture. She had a nasty bump and cut on the back of her head, and this was likely how the killer had kept her sedated. Mrs. DeVille had suffered a serious sexual assault, pre- and post-mortem. The left top bedpost had been snapped off and used to sodomize her. This occurred post-mortem and likely was just to cause a shock when the bodies were found. The cause of death was a stab wound to the neck, just under the ear. She, just like all the other victims, had chunks of flesh torn from her back, breast, and neck, and they'd been removed with teeth. And these occurred after the victim was dead. Mrs. DeVille's husband, Nate, and their 2 children, Ryan and Sasha, were all found bound and gagged with duct tape. They all died of a single knife wound to their throats, sat up against the wall of the master bedroom. The medical examiner clocked their deaths around the same time or slightly after Mrs. DeVille's. Whoever had killed this family had lined them up in the bedroom so they could watch their mother and wife being raped and murdered. My name is Special Agent Peter Quince. The other agents call me Quincy. I've been called into the homicide after this home invasion murder in Lincoln, Nebraska had been the third in a suspected link between 2 other similar mass homicides. The others being the Scott family in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and the Claytons in Austin, Texas. All the murders took place over the course of the last 6 months and were suspected to be by the same person. A man the newspapers were dubbing the Showtime Killer, or STK. According to the crime scene walkthrough experts, in each case the killer broke into the home during the night through an open window. He'd enter the kids' room first, easily subduing the younger and weaker tenants. Then, from what we can tell, he lures the husband out of the room with a noise or a light. He ambushes the husband, subduing him as well. Then, finally, he assaults the female, who are clearly the main targets, with some sort of blunt instrument. He proceeds to line up the husband and kids in a line facing the bed, while he does his thing with his main victim. Once done, he kills the whole family and flees into the night. The Bureau was assigned in on this case to assist Austin, OC, and Lincoln PDs to help create a profile for the killer and brief the local law enforcers, just in case this sicko was still in each of the areas, potentially plotting more victims. Well, it wasn't long ago I'd worked on a similar case, under the wing of a longtime friend, Special Agent James Rodriguez, who was Deputy Team Leader in Behavior Sciences. Together we helped build a profile for a serial killer known as the Cross-Line Cannibal. Well, this profile, along with a police sketch, was broadcast to the world at every opportunity over the course of around a year. And eventually, the correct pair of eyes saw it. The killer's wife. She reported him to the Bureau, and it turns out the killer was a man named Robert Cassidy. Cassidy's wife, Amy Edmonds, knowing her husband's ways and our advice on sociopathic behavior, managed to outsmart him and get a confession on tape. Cassidy was arrested and taken into custody with Dallas PD, as San Antonio didn't have space in their county jail. Here, it was reported by Cassidy that he was violently assaulted in a holding cell by 2 officers. Well, the officers denied it, saying Cassidy had the wounds when he came into custody. Cassidy, who acted as his own attorney during his defense, then tried to use this at his trial in a way of creating reasonable doubt with the jury, saying the confession was made under duress, as he was beaten into saying it. Well, the confession was almost thrown out, if not for one of the officers owning up to the beating with his colleague. The officers were both disciplined and charged with perverting the course of justice, but they were let off with a caution. The officer who came forward was able to save his job, And to this day, I believe he still works there. If memory serves me correctly, his name was Officer Mills. When the confession was entered into evidence, Cassidy approached the prosecution and offered to trade his death for his life. Well, in return, he would give the location of a burial site in Atlanta, where police would find a number of missing persons. 10 victims were found at this site, back from when Cassidy was younger and first developed a taste for murder. In the hole, they found bones and ashes of what turned out to be an old girlfriend, the boy she cheated on Cassidy with, as well as, more significantly, a boarding school teacher and a local drug dealer. The others were prostitutes on the missing persons list. Cassidy was sentenced to 23 consecutive life terms in a maximum security prison. As of this moment, he's currently 20 months into serving his sentence at Florence Prison in Colorado. Given his experience, I decided to consult with Agent Rodriguez on helping with a profile on the home invader being dubbed the Showtime Killer. Oh, in case you're wondering why they call him this, it's because he loves an audience. Well, the next day I caught a flight from Lincoln to Houston and made my way to the basement floor of the Texas field office. I made my way into the back office, where Special Agent Rodriguez was situated. I tentatively knocked on the door, just in case he was in the middle of a meeting or phone call. No one answered, however, so I tried to peer through his window. Well, this didn't go unnoticed, and the head of BSU, Dan Ackerman, came up behind me and tapped me on my shoulder. I turned around, slightly startled. He's not here, I'm afraid," Ackerman said, a slimy edge to his tone. Well, for context, I didn't like Ackerman, and he didn't like me. I don't think there's many that are ranked below him that liked him, to be quite honest. He was the sort to throw his weight around in a passive-aggressive sort of way, and no one could tell him he was wrong, because he never was. But he usually was. You with me? He had suppressed our profile on Robert Cassidy for a while. He was certain that the person we were looking for was a drifter, a homeless man who killed his victims to take their money and then moves on to a new state. Our profile, on the other hand, was based on historical interview tapes of Ted Bundy, another serial killer who abducted women to rape and kill them before dumping their bodies in a nearby wooded area. Bundy was respectable, and to most women, a decent-looking young man. He dressed as policemen, professors, tennis players, and often painted himself as disabled or at least injured. He painted himself as someone the public could trust, and someone that women wouldn't see as a physical threat. We believed our man was someone who did similar things, was someone who was well-groomed and likely somewhat attractive based on the age of the women. They were all young, attractive, and appealing. Not the sort of people who would risk being alone with a homeless drifter who could very well be aggressive. So when it came to the theft of the victims' money, credit cards, and the keys to their homes, well, we profiled this behavior as someone who needed the money, perhaps to disguise a lack of income. Well, we also looked at John Wayne Gacy and Dennis Rader, serial murderers who used their jobs to hide their crimes, as well as using their jobs to find potential victims. Rader, in particular, was also a killer who had a family, hiding his crimes from them for years. Our final profile consisted of 7 main bullet points. 1. Very high sense of self-worth. 2. Poorly or unexplained long absences away from home. 3. Attractive or well-presented white male, likely between 30 and 40. 4. A job that involves traveling the United States with seemingly varying amounts of pay. 5. Spends a lot of money on different clothes and odd items such as fancy dress outfits or disability equipment. 6. Cell phone is switched off for long periods of time during the night whilst away from home. And 7. Unwillingness to elaborate on early life or other absences. We had this profile ready to send out to the news outlets, hoping a wife or girlfriend would notice the odd behavior and phone it in. However, as mentioned, Dan Ackerman told us it was a drifter, and that was that. It was his way or the highway. Pompous asshole. 6 more women had to die before we got lucky. After Cassidy ran into trouble whilst trying to dispose of one of his victims, Julie Devereaux, he, instead of dumping her in a remote wooded area, dumped her body in a city alleyway. He was spotted leaving the scene by a pedestrian, who got a pretty decent look at him. When they described a well-groomed man with slick-back hair and with a square, well-shaven jaw, Ackerman couldn't deny our profile any longer, although it wasn't without trying. Once the profile was out there, it was just waiting until it found the right set of eyes, and on one fateful day, it did. Robert Cassidy's wife, Amy Edmonds, who saw the sketch on a breaking news bulletin, and then, upon looking into the case further, found the profile on the FBI website. She called in her suspicions, and as soon as we heard about Robert Cassidy, we knew we had our man. Yeah, so, I see, do you happen to know where he is? I asked, trying to hold back my contempt for the man. Oh, haven't you heard? We've both been asked to assist organized crime with the swarm's remaining traffic gangs. Given our expertise in the area, it's hardly surprising. So I'm afraid you'll have to find someone else to babysit you on your little assignment. His tone was as condescending as it was patronizing. He knows some agents see him as the man who cost an extra 6 women their lives due to his sheer pig-headedness. And the thing is, Agent Rodriguez was the guy who helped bring down the swarm and created the profile that caught the most vicious serial killer the USA has ever seen. He was Superman to the Bureau, so unfortunately, it was just me to take the stick from this giant asshole. Triple mass homicide a little assignment now? I asked, sarcastically, before adding, just want to make sure we have an accurate profile of the killer. Don't want anything holding back the investigation and costing more lives, do I now? I tried to suppress my smirk as Ackerman's fell into a hardened scowl. He was a little lost for words. Oh, I wish I could bottle this moment. Then, what are you skulking around in here for? Get out there and find them, he said, storming into his office. I decided to leave the building and simply give Agent Rodriguez a call on his cell phone. After a few rings, the call was picked up. Quincy, what's up? What can I do for you? Rodriguez said loudly, speaking over what sounded like a busy task force office. I just need some advice. Sounds pretty busy there. Want me to call you back? I replied. No, absolutely not. These guys can manage for a few minutes without me. We're just setting up a surveillance op on the border, hoping to identify who's trying to take over the swarm's patch. What do you need advice on? Rodriguez asked. Well, James was older than me. He came to Quantico the same time I did, except he worked for Albuquerque PD as a homicide detective for over 10 years before he arrived at the Bureau. I came straight from Oregon State University after completing my master's in criminology. Well, despite me having no practical experience in the field of violent crime, he's never treated me like he knows better than me, despite the fact he does. He's treated me like an older brother. On some days, I'd go as far as saying like a father. Let me guess. The home invasion murders. You've been asked to help create a profile for the authorities of this Showtime killer, James asked. I smiled at his perception. Yep, got it in one. Well, don't know where to begin. It's so different out in the field than what it is in the classroom. You were the brains behind Cassidy, not me. Man, I'm out of my depth, James, I said in an honest tone. James chuckled. You're too hard on yourself. You came up with your own ideas on the profile. You're a good profiler, Peter. Just gotta trust your instincts and remember your studies. I mean, I don't have the time to help you, but I don't know. His sentence trailed off in thought. No, go ahead. What are you thinking? I asked, intrigued. Well, when we did the profile for the CL Cannibal, what did we do? We looked at other killers like Bundy, Gacy, and Rader. Is your guys a home invader? I'd revisit Rader and maybe look at Richard Ramirez, too. Both were home invaders and sexual deviants. But there's, one more avenue you could go down. And I think it could be an untapped resource. Well, I'm all ears, I said, open to his idea. I've seen the reports. Extreme sexual sadism, sodomized after death, signs of cannibalism. Maybe there's a more potent source you can look for information. What about Cassidy himself? James threw the idea on the table. "You think he'll even speak to me?" I asked, taken aback. "Well, one way to find out, I guess. Just play into his vanity and intellectual ego, and I doubt you'll go far wrong. Let me know how it goes, Quince. I gotta get back to these lot, but good luck, and I have faith in you," James said, wishing me well. I thanked him for the advice and decided to call Florence Prison and request a VO. Cassidy had been already charged and sentenced, so if he didn't want to talk to me, then, well, he didn't have to. While I waited to hear back from the prison with Cassidy's decision, I decided to go look at one of the previous crime scenes while I was in Texas. I drove up to Austin, back to the scene of the first murder. I pulled up outside 423 Caroline Street at around 9:23 p.m. What looked like a beautiful suburban humble abode 6 months ago, well, now had the aura of a haunted house attraction. The street was dark and very quiet. Extremely quiet. A lot of cold houses on here now, and a lot of for sale signs had gone up, and a lot of bars had been installed on windows too. The bars also looked quite new. I couldn't help feel a shade depressed. I armed myself with a torch and the memo recorder on my phone. I took the keys given to me by Austin PD and slid them into the lock. The door swung open with a slight creak, letting the Nebraska moonlight radiate into the dark hallway. I entered the house and immediately felt uneasy. The empathy I had for the family was coursing through me. The terror they felt that night when a stranger was in their house with malign intentions. I made my way to the master bedroom and flicked on the light. Dry blood was splattered on the walls in a pattern consistent with a slashing motion. There was an obscenely large brown stain on the mattress. I walked over to the window and looked into the back garden. A large oak tree with sturdy branches sits around 30 meters from the master bedroom window. A great vantage point to stalk his victims. Is that what you did, huh, you sick fuck? Did you sit right there and watch Mrs. Clayton undress? Was watching simply not enough for you anymore? Couldn't you control your urges any longer? I said into the recording. I walked back into the hallway and noticed a picture was missing from the wall outside the children's room. The picture's missing from outside the children's room. Crime scene reports that there were shards of broken glass and a large indentation in the wall's foundation. Did one of the kids try to alert the parents? He rushed to catch them. Did the father and the assailant struggle for a weapon and they forced each other into this area? I said, adding another memo to my phone. I then headed into the children's room. I walked over to the window. I pressed record once again. The door was locked when the police arrived the next day. No sign of forced entry in any of the doors or windows. However, the children's window was a fire escape window, installed recently to comply with building safety regulations. The Claytons were planning on selling up and moving to Canada. It was a hot night that evening. Did the children leave the window open for fresh air? It'd be the only window that could open far enough for a grown man to fit through. All of a sudden, a sharp noise cracked the silence of the night. I startled heavily, hitting stop on the record in a panic. I got my breathing under control, drew my weapon, and peered back into the hall. The front door had slammed shut in the wind. It didn't even seem that gusty, to be honest, but nevertheless I shook my head at myself in disappointment for being such a scaredy cat. I decided it was getting late. I couldn't shake the horrible dread that the family must have felt that night, and my head wasn't where it needed to be. I exited the house, locked up, and drove the keys back to the police department. Once I was sat in the departure lounge at the airport, I went through the case files of all 3 homicides and noticed a pattern. I made sure no one was within earshot and made another recording. At the Scott house, there were no signs of a burglary. No money or anything of financial value was taken. However, Marilyn Scott's sister said that there was a family photo missing from the living room. Well, the only reason she knew is because the photo was from when she bought them a professional home shoot as a Christmas present. She'd loved it, as they all looked so happy in it. So, why did the killer take it? Also, at the DeVille house, there was a nail in the wall above the fireplace. The wall looked bare as if something was missing. presumably a painting or photo. Were these his trophies? Did he potentially hate the appearance of a happy home? I pulled down the seat flap and began making up a base for my profile. Questions that needed answering and such. Well, you see, psychology in violent crimes such as dealing with an armed hostage taker and so on, well, it's important to find out who you're dealing with so you can understand what has caused this situation to occur. And thus we can then try to use that to help diffuse the situation. When it comes to profiling for a violent crime such as a homicide or rape, or even both, we flip the process. We ask ourselves what has caused this situation, why has this situation happened this way, and then that can give us a base on who we're dealing with. The main questions I needed answering were, why does he kill the entire family? Or more so, why does he make them watch the mother? Why does he take the photos? What do they mean to him? And, most importantly, how is he choosing the victims? And I knew the quicker I figured out the answers, the more lives I'd save. Part 2. It wasn't more than a week later that the prison contacted me. It was a Tuesday morning, if I remember correctly. My cell rang and the number was a Denver area code. I answered it with eagerness, yet a shade of apprehension, just in case it was a no. Special Agent Quince. How do you do? This is Warden Milner from Florence ADX. I have a visitor request here for yourself to see, Mr. Robert Maxwell Cassidy. The man said in an Ivy League type of tone, a well-educated, stern and controlling person, I assumed. Good morning, Mr. Milner. I'm very well, thank you. Yes, that's right. I know you guys have strict protocols, but I really think a behavioral science interview with Cassidy will aid in creating a, At that, I was cut off. I'm afraid I'm not overly excited about granting the VO. You see, Special Agent Quince, I have a fortress here. A fortress full of drug barons, bank robbers, terrorists, even the leader of the AB, but Robert Cassidy is probably the most dangerous of them all, believe it or not. He doesn't need to have 10 white supremacist thugs shiv you in the laundry room, or have his Al-Qaeda buddies fly a plane into your building to get his point across, he informed me, and I scoffed. I'm well aware of how dangerous he is, Mr. Milner. I've been to his crime scenes. I've seen what he does to young, vulnerable women. And as I'm sure you're aware, we have a case that needs his urgent He cut me off again. Well, he could kill half my staff with just a ballpoint pen given the chance, Mr. Quince. In fact, he's been with us just under 2 years now, and in that time, he's been involved in a number of violent incidents with his fellow inmates. But not just the inmates. There have been other incidents, some which have cost the taxpayers of this country millions in staff compensation payouts. And someone like you coming in means I have to take him out of the hole, and I think seeing one of the men who helped put him in there, well, may somewhat agitate Mr. Cassidy. Once again I scoffed. Agitate? How would it agitate you, Mr. Milner, if a psychopath slipped through your children's window tonight, tied them up and made them watch while he raped your wife with a bedpost and castrated you alive? Well, as soon as the words left my mouth, I wanted the world to swallow me up. There was a pause before Mr. Milner simply said, I'm not married. I couldn't hold back my amused smile. Look, my point is, there's a person who's done this 3 times, and he'll do it again. Now, while Cassidy wasn't a home invader, one of the bodies we found in a burial site contained a male victim, a head teacher from a boarding school in Atlanta. Oh, the man had had his genitals removed with a bowie knife, similar MO used by our home invader in his last murder. An interview into why he did this may give us an idea of who we're looking for. I'm asking you to try and save some lives here, Mr. Milner. How can you say no to that? I asked, sincerely. There was another long pause while he mulled over my question. A quiet sigh before he simply said, Okay, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Bring ID, no firearms. Good day, Special Agent Quince. The phone then went dead. Asshole, I said to no one in particular. I was on a plane that night to Colorado. Myself and the new kid, Agent Bodkins, arrived at the Supermax facility around 9:30 a.m. I'd heard of Florence being the Alcatraz of the Rockies, but I'll be honest, it was truly daunting. A modern-day fortress, housing the real-life monsters that walk this earth. We pressed forward, through the guard station, signing in our vehicle.
"Been expecting you. Lieutenant Perkins is in the visitors center for you,"
the guard informed. I thanked him and parked the car in the allocated bay. As we entered the building, a well-built, military-looking officer saluted and approached us.
"Special Agent Quint and Agent Balkins. I'm CO Lieutenant Perkins. I'll be escorting you both today and supervising the interview," he told me sternly.
Yes, good morning, Lieutenant. I was hoping that our interview would be just the three of us." Well, my sentence wasn't even half finished before he began shaking his head in robotic disagreement.
"No can do. Robert Cassidy is in the hole. He needs to be kept under 24-hour supervision and have at least 2 firearms aimed at him when he's not in his cell,"
he said, whilst I looked over his shoulder to another CO wearing sunglasses, rifle at the ready. "It sounds a little OTT, don't you think?" said Agent Bodkins with hints of naivety to his scoff. Even though a small part of me agreed, I knew it wouldn't come across well. I gave him a look over my shoulder, scolding him.
"No, I do not," he said purposely.
He took a moment in his mind before saying,
"Perhaps I should show you something,"
he said curiously, and led us into a nearby office. Well, the office wasn't large. It didn't need to be, I guess. Just contained file cabinets, a desk, a kitchen area, and a television set. He opened a file cabinet drawer and, after sifting through the individual dividers, found what he was looking for. He pulled out a DVD, slotted it into the player, and turned on the television.
"What are we watching here, Lieutenant?"
I asked impatiently.
"Security footage for a few months back,"
he replied, concentrating on rewinding the tape to a specific point. Bodkins and I decided not to ask any more questions and instead made ourselves comfortable on the edge of the desk and faced the screen. An image soon began playing. It depicted a hallway. Around roughly 4 people were mulling around in there, one of whom was Robert Cassidy. He was wearing a cleaner's uniform that indicated that he was a prisoner and not a member of staff. He was mopping a floor, back turned to the security gate, the camera pointing down at his face. "What are we watching here, Luke?" I began to ask before I was shushed and told to keep watching. After a few seconds, the image shows a guard come to the gate, unlocks it, opens it, and walks away. The 3 men in the hallway with Cassidy see this and immediately make a swift exit out of the gate. Cassidy stays where he is. Soon, 4 large men, all with short haircuts and swastika tattoos, rush into the hallway. The last man in closes the gate behind him and continues to rush Cassidy with the others. Cassidy turns to them and begins to crack his neck, as if warming up for a workout. One of the men lashes out at him, punching him to the ground, and the men are suddenly like hyenas, diving at a wounded gazelle and picking at its carcass. Kicking, stomping, and punching. Well, they were really laying into him. However, after around 8 to 10 seconds, one of the men suddenly hunches over in pain and stumbles across the hall with a toothbrush sticking out of his groin. Soon Cassidy bursts through the gap left by the man. He's armed with the mop. He swings it at one of the men, breaking it around his head. With the remaining half of the mop handle left in his hands, he places it around the back of one of their necks and uses the leverage to deliver an extremely vicious headbutt. What I assume is blood flies everywhere. The remaining thug jumps on Cassidy's back, trying to apply a rear naked choke. Cassidy throws his weight forward, flipping the man over him and onto his back. Cassidy, with all his might, then drives the jagged end of the handle into the eye of the 4th man. The man twitches uncontrollably on the floor. Cassidy goes into the pockets of the unconscious man that he hit with a mop and finds another shiv. He stands up, wipes the blood from his nose and mouth, up through his hair, slicking it back, as if using it as some sort of hair gel. He then saunters over to one of the men on the floor, who already has a shiv stuck in them. They let go of their wound so they can hold their hands up in a plea for mercy, but Cassidy doesn't let up. In a total frenzy, he puts at least 13 holes in this guy before the guard opens the door
and a group of COs storm into the hallway and pin him to the floor. The lieutenant pauses the video and turns to see our reactions, which, to be fair, are somewhat astounded. Someone cut in line ahead of Cassidy, so he bit his ear off, then proceeded to eat his hair in front of the whole wing. Savage, right? Well, turns out the victim's cousin was an Aryan shock collar, put out a word to have Cassidy beaten to a pulp, then have his balls cut off and hung from the canteen ceiling. He ordered 4 of the toughest Neos to do it. He even paid off the guard to facilitate it. He was meant to erase the footage after it happened, but seeing as Cassidy turned the tables, the alarm was raised and the guard was apprehended before it could be covered up. 2 of those men are dead. The other was in a coma for a week. Only one of them is alive and well. Well, if having 17 stitches in your face and a metal-plated nose is classed as well, he quipped, before beginning to press fast forward for a few seconds. He was in Site A when this occurred. His safety was in breach at this point, so we decided to house him in Site B while he recovered from the attack. Well, Site B is less secure. That's where we house payrollees, detox inmates, good behavior, and vulnerable prisoners. He hit play. It showed what looked like a ward of a hospital before I clocked on that it was the prison infirmary. Cassidy lay in the far bed in the corner. A nurse came to apply what may have been jelly from an ultrasound before suddenly Cassidy shot up and grabbed both sides of the nurse's face and began to gore at it. He then slammed her head against his bed frame, knocking her out cold. He then climbed out of the bed, smashed the window, and pulled himself out of it. Perkins hit stop, turned to us and said, "Jenny Pratt, sweet girl, didn't deserve that. Well, she lived, but she'll never look the same again." Consolation was he didn't get far at all. He was shot with 5 rubber bullets before he got within 200 feet of the fence. After that, Warden Milner ordered him to be put in Site C, aka the Hole. The Hole was a place we built underneath Site A. It's where we put the people who don't deserve to ever see daylight again. Cassidy's been down there for 6 months now. I'm responsible for his, shall we say, well-being, Perkins said with a hint of sadism in his smile. So you can understand why we're all apprehensive about any relaxation or complacency when it comes to Cassidy's security. If we let him in that room, no cuffs and no weapons on him, he'll likely ask for a pen to sign your waiver. And when you give it, he'll kill you and your partner with it and make another break for it. Well, I scoffed at this extreme catastrophizing. We're FBI, Lieutenant. We're not idiots. The prisoner will not be given anything sharp, blunt, or heavy. He doesn't need to be unchained. You can have weapons at the ready, but outside the room. We need Cassidy to speak unobjectively and unadulterated, or for his insights to be useful in our case. Now yes, Robert Cassidy is potentially dangerous to me and Agent Bodkins while we're in that room. But we have a man who's breaking into homes, tying up kids and making them watch while their mummy is raped and their daddy is murdered. So, I don't have too much time to be worried about myself. I have lives to save, I said in a passionate voice, while Perkins mulled over my words. Milner told me to throw this out, try to put you off. But my mother lives in Omaha. She's terrified of that home invader killer. You really think Cassidy can help you get him? He asked, genuinely curious. He's a serial killer who targeted young yet stable women, beat them, raped them, tortured them, divulged in acts of post-mortem mutilation. If he tells us about why he did those things, then yes, we can hopefully use those insights to create a profile of who is doing the home invasion murders, I answered confidently. Perkins stood up, turned off the TV, and began to open the office door. Then, let's go. Part 3. We made our way over to Site A on a glorified golf cart. Site A was daunting to look at, even more so seeing the increase in guard numbers, more barbed wire, more lights, more towers. Once inside, the cells seemed to look more like vaults than they did rooms. 8x9 safety deposit boxes containing the most dangerous men on Earth.
Perkins led us over to one of the cell doors that looked different to the rest. He entered a code, covering the pad with his body like he was entering his banking pin. Once he entered the code, 2 card readers lit up from red to green on either side of the door. Perkins signaled to one of the other guards to come down. Once the guard got to the door, they both took out a key card on red lanyards from under their vests. They both aimed their cards into the slots, eyed each other as they counted down from 3, then simultaneously swiped the cards downward. The door beeped. Some mechanics did their thing, and the pneumatics pushed the door open to reveal a modified lift shaft. Perkins pressed the intercom and spoke to a voice. "Prepare prisoner H45635 for federal post-sentence interview. Chains remain on. Interview room 3, the one with the glass divider. I'm in the elevator with Agents Quince and Bodkins right now, requesting descent." He said this as I looked into the camera in the top corner of the elevator. The voice responded. "Descension approved. Please hold the rail." The cell began to move downward in a diagonal fashion. Once at the bottom, 2 guards repeated the procedure of opening the door and let myself, Bodkins, and Perkins out into an all-white hallway, lit up with large ceiling lights. The hallway was several feet wide with a built-in divider that designated a one-way system. On the right-hand side of the hallway, there were around 6 rooms. 4 were for interviews. 1 was the medical room. 1 was an admin cell or a search room. The remaining room was likely a staff room, if I had to take a guess. Opposite to the 6 rooms on the other side were 6 cells. These cells looked like bank vaults for the world's most prized possessions. Nothing was getting out of them. At the end of the corridor was a cylinder guard station where a guard sat facing us through a barred window. Behind him was a large space. The whole had an eye look to it from a bird's eye view. In the guard station I could see CCTV screens, intercoms, automatic rifles and pistols. Inside the station were around 6 guards. "Gentlemen, welcome to the hole," Perkins said theatrically. "How many people you got down here?" Bodkins asked, peering around at the cells. "Just 3. The 93 Trade Center bomber, Tyler Bingham, leader of the AB, and Robert Cassidy, the Cross-Line Cannibal. Now, normally they'd be upstairs, however we bring them down here if we believe they're a detrimental risk to the staff, the public, or the prisoners or themselves," Perkins informed us, as we made our way past the cells and towards the guard station. "Surely the rest of them deserve to be down here too," Bodkins suggested. Perkins smirked. "I couldn't agree more, kid, but we save this place for those who pose a current, ongoing, known, and credible threat to the people around them. The bomb was found using covert communications that were linked with a planned attack in Kenya. Bingham had 2 prisoners in Stockton shivved, and Cassidy was going to be the 3rd. Well, down here, there's no chance of having any communication with the person in the next cell, let alone the outside world. Okay, if you want to make your way in here," he said, opening up interview room 3. Inside there were 2 chairs facing a desk unit built into a solid steel wall. The room's interior was mirrored on the other side of a 2x1.5 window. Bulletproof glass, I assumed. The only difference was there was a singular chair on the other side. "Take a seat. I'll go get him," Perkins informed us. We obliged and took a seat as advised and began to set up a mini tripod area. We then sat there for around 25 minutes, spreading our time equally between twiddling our thumbs and sighing. Before, finally, on the other side of the glass, in the left-hand corner, a door buzzed and began to slowly open. Perkins entered the room, holding what can only be described as a chain leash. As he pulled the chain into the room, what was attached to the chain also entered the room. A black hooded man in a contrasting white straitjacket came waddling into the room, wrapped up in a mountain of steel and shackles. Perkins took the end of the chain he was holding, almost like taking a dog for a walk, and fastened it to an anchor point on the desk. He guided the man to the chair and forcibly drove him into the seat by pressing down on his shoulders. He removed the hood, revealing Robert Cassidy's pale, unkempt face. Well, a harrowing lack of sunlight and shaving cream will do that to you, I guess. I noticed Cassidy had a fading black eye and a split lip. The incident with the Aryan attack was over 8 months ago. These were from something else. Can we not remove some of these chains? I feel like I'm interviewing Houdini, I asked. Perkins shook his head and scowled. It's this, or I have 2 guards in here with loaded weapons pointing at him for the course of the interview. I know you may think what we do here is overkill, Agent Quince, but you didn't see my Perkins caught himself. That nurse's face. We take no chances here, he informed us. He made his way out of the room, and before he shut the door behind him, he said, "There's a red button under the desk on both sides. If either party want to end the interview, press that." He then shut the door, and we heard the mechanisms click and the pneumatics pump away. "Good morning, agents," Cassidy said with a superficial politeness. "Lovely weather we're having, aren't we?" he quipped sarcastically. Never lasts, though, does it?" Bodkins chuckled, as both Cassidy and I eyed him in disbelief, wondering how the joke went over his head. "Do you mind if we videotape this, Robert?" "Can I call you Robert?" I asked. "I live in a 6x8 vault, 150 feet underground, hugged by canvas and chains. I don't really think I have much of a say in anything. You videotape and call me what you please, Agent. Makes no odds to me," he said nonchalantly. "Okay, so, we're conducting this post-sentence interview as part of our behavior science survey with men such as yourself, who've been convicted of multiple cases of extremely violent crime. Anything you tell us in this interview cannot be used against you in any future charges or your applications for payroll." Well, I read out from the legal contract. Cassidy couldn't hold back his laughter. "Does it look like a place that offers parole?" he chuckled. "Look, I was convicted of 22 murders of 22 young and privileged white women, Agent. They'll never let me out of here while I take a breath. So there's really no need for all this fine print nonsense. This is the only time in 8 months that I've seen another room, other than the one I sleep, shit, and eat in, of course. So please, get to the fucking point." "Well, okay. There are some things we need help with. Things that only someone like yourself may know." I eased into him, and Cassidy grinned like a Cheshire cat and began to chuckle as he looked at the floor. He raised his head and flashed his pearly yellows at us. You've got some other naughty boy out there right now, haven't you? What's wrong, Agent? Is he not making it easy for you? So you want to create one of those psycho mumbo-jumbo profiles for him? Waste of time," he dismissed. Bodkins suddenly grew a backbone from nowhere. "Well, it worked with you, didn't it?" Cassidy's smile turned to a blank expression bordering on menace. "I was only caught because I was betrayed. Not because some backroom boy made some assumptions about my childhood. People like me can't be summed up in a few bullet points, Agent Bodwin." "Bodkins," he snapped, confirming his name. "Sorry," Cassidy said, clearly not sorry at all. And not to mention that she totally outsmarted you. The double wiretrap trick was all her idea, you know. Our only input was advising her that you're just like every other violent sociopath out there, and you'd love to brag about the things you've done. Make you feel special, even when you're not. Oh, Bodkins was really going in on him. Cassidy's glare was horrifying. I decided to intervene. "Look, Robert, what I think Bodkins is trying to say here is that whatever your opinions are on the work we do in behavioral science, we at the Bureau really think that a background of your life and your emotional state before, during, and after your crimes would really give us some aid in our investigation into these home invasion murders. As we have over 30 years of research proving that there are links between people who murder compulsively." I felt my diplomatic approach had soothed the situation, but his face still looked unhappy. I needed to repair the relationship. Where did you get that? I asked, nodding my head toward the injuries on Cassidy's face. Well, he finally grinned. Fell, totally by accident, in my 6x8 cell, all by myself, he scoffed. Well, at least that's what Perkins' report said, Cassidy added facetiously. Are you saying that's not what happened? I asked. Cassidy smiled at the naivety of my question and rolled his pupils back into the top corners of his eyes, guiding my vision to the CCTV camera in the corner of the ceiling. Oh, absolutely not, Agent. Whatever Lieutenant Perkins said happened is the God's honest truth, he said dramatically. Look, I could potentially speak with the warden, maybe even the Department of Justice, get them to agree a transfer, trial period of course. You'll have to stay in Florence as part of your sentence, but maybe I could get you back to Site A. Maximum security would still apply, but you'd at least be able to see daylight every day. Daily exercise, 3 meals a day, maybe even a TV. Cassidy's laughter cut me short. Well, yeah, I've been missing Ellen, to be honest, Cassidy joked. I could see that you're away from Lieutenant Perkins, and maybe then there'll be no more falls, I added. Cassidy's humid expression faded, and he eyed me seriously. You can really make that happen? His question put every inch of me on edge. His eyes bored into my central nervous system, searching for any hint of deceit. I tried to hold my nerve. There's no way I'd be able to pull any of those strings. Cassidy was one of the top 10 most wanted. Yes, if the insights you divulge help us create a comprehensive psychological profile of the Showtime killer, and that profile leads to his arrest, then maybe the DOJ... Showtime. Sounds like an interesting name. Why do they call him that? Cassidy asked, intrigued. Well, it's pretty dark, but... Aren't they all? Cassidy asked with a smile. Well, they call him Showtime because he likes to perform for an audience. Wow, he sounds incredible. All the best ones are. I imagine he'll keep you both busy chasing your little tails around. So, of course, you can understand my hesitance to enter into an agreement with so many ifs, buts, and maybes. Oh, I could pour my heart out, and I'd still be down here for years while you two idiots figured out what to do with it. Cassidy sat back, letting his insults sink in. Well, however, should you commit any violent acts against another prisoner, nurse, guard, or yourself, should you try and escape, then any offer or deal goes away, and you come straight back here. Or you can just not speak to us, go back to your vault and wait for your next fall. We sat back in our chairs now and folded our arms, waiting for his response. Cassidy mulled it over. Okay. Well then, what would you like to know? He relaxed back into his chair, arms folded, not that he had much choice in that matter though. I opened up a file I had with me and held it against the glass, so that Cassidy could read it. The file showed the entire crime scene photo of the DeVille family murder. Cassidy eyed it intensely. I swear I saw a glint in his eye. Who's this then? Cassidy asked, cocking his head at the photo. Claire DeVille. She's the third victim, I informed. Cassidy went from scanning the document to his vision snapping towards me once again, his mouth slightly ajar, his brows raised. Were the others like this? Cassidy asked, his sick interest piqued. I nodded. This was the only murder where the victim was found with a bedpost forced into her anus. The husband also had his genitals removed. Both these actions occurred post-mortem. Well, she's technically the 10th victim, 13 altogether because he kills the rest of the family too. Well, after he makes them watch first.
The females are the targets. The rest are just a means to an end,
Cassidy said bluntly. Can you explain what you mean? Agent Bodkins asked, jotting down the odd keyword on his notepad.
He wanted to humiliate them,
I thought out loud. Cassidy smiled at me.
Very good, Agent Quince. Almost, but not quite.
No, he wanted to dehumanize her. He wanted her to feel helpless, all her loved ones watching. The desire to rescue her etched all over their faces, but they were unable to help her. Cassidy lectured. Why, though? What makes you say that? Is that the goal with your victims? Bodkins asked. Cassidy gave him a stern look.
Are you here for my help, or are you here to pick apart what I did? Just trust what I say,
Cassidy snapped. Well, I intervened and rephrased Bodkins' question.
I think what Agent Bodkins is asking is, can you give us some sort of theory behind your hypothesis?
Cassidy grinned as I jumped through one of his hoops.
Well, maybe this person that you're looking for. Maybe he grew up in a household that's his daddy or his stepdaddy who wasn't so nice to him. Maybe he expected his mom to rescue him, or stand up for him at least.
But instead she just stood there and watched. I thought out loud once again. Cassidy smiled and gave me a round of applause.
Now you're getting it,
he said approvingly. Is that why you killed these women? Did your daddy beat you while your mommy was too busy with her career? Is that why you targeted successful and distinguished women? Well, Bodkins' question was full of malice. Cassidy looked at him, puzzled by his hostility. Well, so was I, quite frankly. Then it suddenly clicked in Cassidy's mind, and he flashed a sinister smile at Bodkins.
Now it makes sense. What's wrong, Agent Bogdan? Did I kill someone you knew?
Cassidy probed. Bodkins looked at the floor, trying to hide his contempt. He shook his head and muttered the word,
Bodkins. Oh, I did, didn't I? Which one was it? Was it the one I sodomized with her own bicycle seat? Or was it the one whose head I nearly squeezed off with barbed wire?
Cassidy probed, and I saw something in Bodkins snap. You know what? I just think it's bullshit. All this blaming your twisted actions on some traumatic event. You're not special, you're just average. You're the same as all the others. You think you're a pioneer, but really, you're just fucking textbook.
Okay, I think we just need to take...
I tried to calm the issue, but it was too late. Cassidy rose from his feet in anger. His pupils were dilated, and they were laser-focused on Agent Bodkins.
I really don't think you'd have the gusto to speak those words to me if we weren't separated by this wall. And Agent, believe me, should the day ever come where you and me are on the same side of the wall, I'll make you regret those words. This interview is over,
Cassidy snapped, forcing his knee into the red button under his desk. The alarm sounded, and the guards burst into his side of the room and retrieved him back to his cell. I looked at Bodkins with bafflement and a shed of anger. He looked away in his embarrassment at not being able to control his emotions. I shook my head and pulled myself together, and we packed up and left the prison. We didn't say a word to each other whilst we were in the walls of Florence, but the minute my car door closed, sealing us inside, I lost my head.
What the fuck was that?
I screamed, my head falling into my hands after. Sorry, Quince. I just...
You just what?
Cost us our best source of psychological insight into the man who slaughtered 13 people in 6 months? Well, my question was raged and rhetorical. Bodkins aimed his gaze at the floor. I grabbed the wheel and extended my arms, driving my back against the chair. Tensing my body for a few seconds, then letting the tension flow out of me while I relaxed. Bodkin sensed the ease in my demeanor and used this opportunity to explain himself. Cassidy's fifth victim, Kim Bailey, Bodkin said bluntly. I scanned my brain hard. Kim Bailey was a successful 25-year-old college graduate. She was ready to study law at Harvard. Well, she'd recently moved to the area and was out at a student bar when she met Robert Cassidy. Her body was found a couple of days after her disappearance in Coulter Park Reservation. She'd had a knife taken to her reproductive organs, and this wasn't done post-mortem. Well, this was horrifying enough, but when I realized that she was originally from Iowa, Bodkin's hometown, I cringed. What was she to you? I asked softly, facing forward, mainly to avoid looking at Bodkins, as I could hear his somber mood bordering into sobs. She was in my class during my senior year. We were kind of a thing, he confessed. A thing? I probed. We were together for 4 years, and she was my first. First what? Oh my God. Are you fucking kidding me? I snapped. I checked my anger, though, and considered his grief. I sighed out my anger. What I mean to say is, do you not think that this is something you should have told me before you went in there? I asked, diplomatically. Bodkins pinched the bridge of his nose, catching the tears on his fingertips. I gave him a few seconds to give his answer. I just wanted to see him, meet this so-called criminal mastermind, the guy who was on TV representing himself at the trial, taking apart the witnesses on the stand. So suave, so intelligent, so charismatic. I heard all about those young female groupies who were outside the court, forming some kind of sick fan club. I didn't know what to expect, but he seemed too... He couldn't think of the word. Normal, I ventured. I don't know if that's the word, but it'll do, Bodkin settled. Serial murderers rarely look like the monsters we imagine them to be. I just wanted to see who took my high school sweetheart. I don't know what I really expected, but just to hear him blame the whole thing on his upbringing, it's just so... Textbook, I quoted. Bodkins perked up and nodded. Look, I understand your grief and your reaction, but I think it's best you don't take part in these interviews. If we have another interview, that is, I advised. Yeah, me too, Bodkins accepted. You can help to create the profile and relay to the locals, but as far as collecting the data, I really don't think you should ever meet Robert Cassidy again. Agreed. Okay, so now I just need a replacement. I need someone who's smart, objective, understands the criminal mind, and has experience in dealing with psychopaths. I began to think hard. Bodkins perked up and snapped his fingers. Oh, I have just the person, he exclaimed. I looked at him curiously. He began to press buttons on the GPS. I turned my curiosity to the small screen on the dashboard. He pressed the Calculate Route button, and soon the machine was directing us towards the University of Denver. Part 4. We arrived at the university roughly 2 hours and 15 minutes later. We exited the car and made our way into the building. I'd taken a well-earned nap in the car journey up to Denver. It had already been a long day, and it was only 1 p.m. We made small talk as we walked down the halls of the 155-year-old building. I opened up first. So, who is this person? How do you know her? I asked curiously, honestly surprised where Bodkins was pulling this from. Bodkins was a good agent, started legwork as a former homicide detective for Iowa PD before he came to the Bureau, but still he didn't strike me as the university type. Professor Ruth Maddock, PhD in both psychopathy and criminology, specializes in sexual violence crimes. She teaches seminars here to the upcoming academics. Meanwhile, conducts research on the criminal mind. I met her when I was dealing with a serial rapist known as the Davenport Ripper a number of years back. When I was out of my depth, Quince, I was used to drug deals gone wrong and wives who got sick of their cheating husbands. I didn't know how to approach these crime scenes. Someone in the state crime lab recommended her, telling me that a few detectives from nearby states like Wyoming, Kansas, South Dakota, well, they'd consult with her on similar cases. Sounds like quite a woman, I confessed. She is. We got together with the case files. She informed me that the ferociousness of the rape was not exclusively an indicator that the perp knew the victim personally. She hypothesized that the unsub was likely a married man, chastised and cuckolded by a promiscuous wife. The victims were his fantasy of what he'd like to do to his wife, but didn't have the balls to do due to the hold she had over him. Did you catch him? I was actually really intrigued. Yeah, 2 more bodies dropped. We saw that the women were all white, similar ages, blonde hair. They all had some type of cosmetic surgery to enhance their beauty. Fake breasts, Botox, tummy tucks, and so on. Anyway, she deduced that the unsub was likely a small, weak-looking man. Otherwise, his violence would be aimed towards the men who slept with his wife. She also told me that most sexually motivated criminals tend to return to the scene of their crimes. If the unsub was unable to have normal sexual releases due to his toxic marriage, his impotency and feelings of sexual inadequacy, and finding it difficult to lure another victim, well, then he may return to the scene of a kill to relive the power and control he felt and the elation of the release. I didn't say anything, but my eager face told Bodkins I was hooked. Well, he killed 6 by this point. It took a lot of manpower, but we staked out those sites after the timeline between the murders suggested he was struggling to find a new victim, probably due to everyone being on high alert. One night, we were parked up at Rock Island National Cemetery. It was 3:23 a.m. Me and my partner dozing off when we realized there's someone in the trees. We catch the guy masturbating, holding the 3rd victim's necklace. You're kidding? I asked, slightly amused. Nope. So, this is why I think if there's anyone that we should bring in to help us with the Showtime killer, it should be Professor Maddock. She'll be able to interpret Cassidy's insights better than I ever could anyway, Bodkins said, modestly. Okay, you're a good agent, Dave. You just had a wobble, that's all, and an understandable wobble, too, I assured him, easing his pride. And his smile told me he appreciated that as we came close to the lecture hall where the receptionist told us we'd find the professor. A criminology seminar on child psychopathy. Besides, I added, causing Bodkins to pause for a brief second to heed what I had to say. He raised his eyebrows to indicate he was all ears. A young and professionally successful white woman. Well, she's just Cassidy's type, I said with a cheeky wink as I pushed the door. We entered the room. Ruth Maddock was as strikingly beautiful as she was clearly smart. I imagine when it came to those student-teacher fantasies, a huge percent of her male students, and hell, probably some of the female students too, were indulging right this second. She wore her glasses seductively halfway down her nose. Her blood-red hair with natural brown tints flowed into a bobble and poured down her back like a silky waterfall. And with each tap of her black 5-inch heels on the stage, each mesmerized student's heart skipped a beat. Their eyes glared at the black leather straps hugging her beautiful, smooth legs, and each of them felt an intense spout of jealousy over her own footwear. Her pencil skirt embraced her figure tight, whilst her blazer equally caressed her fitted red shirt. The collar of her blouse was buttoned up just enough to look classy among her colleagues, but unbuttoned just enough to make some heads turn, and stay turned until she was out of view. She was just finishing her lecture when we entered the room. On the large screen behind her on stage was a slide that appeared to be a philosophical question. Made or born?
So, guys, what we've deduced today is that these sorts of perpetrators start their compulsions very young. The question, though, are these types of compulsions brought on by the child's negative experience? Or are they already present and the experiences are simply what determine what type of compulsion the perp has? That's what I'd like your papers to be on. For reading material, I'd recommend Adrian Raine's Violence and Psychopathy, The Mask of Sanity, and The Current Trends of Criminal Psychopathy. Thank you. You may leave. Have a great weekend, guys.
She began to turn off the slideshow as the students rose from their seats and made their way past us up the aisle. Bodkins and her made eye contact, and they waved pleasantries at each other as we made our way down to her. As I walked down, a student barged into me, causing her to drop her textbooks. I was ashamed to say I was too busy trying to keep my tongue from rolling out of my mouth to watch where I was going. The impact and noise of hardback books hitting auditorium steps was enough to snap me out of my lusting daydream. I apologized in an obligatory manner and began to pick up the textbooks, praying Professor Maddock hadn't seen that. "Oh my God! Agent Quince!" the female student exclaimed. I looked up, wondering how on earth this person knew who I was. "Oh my Lord!" I exclaimed, bursting into a chuckle at how amazingly small the world could be at times. "Ashley Benning? What are you—" I decided after everything that had happened, I wanted to do what you guys do. I'm studying criminal psychology, forensic psychiatry, and criminology. Maybe one day I'll be calling you boss, she chuckled. Well, you'd make a phenomenal agent. If you're anything like your mom, you'll do really well. My comment made her face change from happy-go-lucky to sulky teen. Ugh. She brought that psycho into our lives in the first place. Had a freaking baby with him and everything. Drove my dad away. Just because she had him arrested doesn't make her anything special. Her arms were now folded, and she turned away from me to scowl. I couldn't help but smile. Ooh, touchy subject, huh? Didn't realize you two didn't get on. No, I partly came out here to get away from her. We haven't spoken much ever since she threw my dad out. Well, she said some horrible things about him in the courtroom. Said he was a terrible man who abused her, but yet, well, then she shacks up with Michael Myers. My dad was right. She is deluded. I could tell Ashley's father had turned her against Amy. Well, the thing is, I'd met both Jeff and Amy, and I knew who I believed. I didn't entertain the drama, though. Well, look, neither of my parents are with me anymore, Ash. Don't spend your life hating one of them. Cassidy could have easily killed your mother that day. The way she looked at the floor and flexed her eyebrows showed me there was a part of her that knew I was right. So, what are you doing here anyway? What's possibly here in Color... Oh, you've been to see him, she said, an edge to her tone. I nodded. Well, I'm, fairly new to the BSU. Up until I met you, I worked organized crime amongst other things. I don't have much field experience, especially not on my own, and Rodriguez is working on a special task force right now, so it's just me and Bodkins, I said with a shrug of modesty. So, what's Robert had to say for himself then? She asked with suspicion. I leaned in close so no one could hear. Sure you've heard of the Showtime killer? I asked, speculatively. And she nodded. The home invader, yeah? It's got a lot of people shaken up. 3 murders, all different states. Could strike anywhere next. There's nothing scarier than the thought of someone creeping into your house at night with sick intentions. In fact, a lot of the other students here are that obsessed. They're doing their thesis on it, she confessed. Yeah, well, he's very good. Very good. He's not leaving any DNA, so we need to build a psychological profile of the killer. We're trying to get Robert Cassidy to tell us things that no one seems to know about his past. Now, I can't go into specifics, as you know, but we're hoping with that info we can speed up the process. We're hoping your professor will help out, too, I said, looking at Ruth Maddock once again. I wasn't able to look away, and Ashley smiled at me as she noticed. Yep, she's a fox, she said, smirking at me. Well, I snapped out of it, and I smirked back. Look, I shall have you know I'm here in a totally professional capacity, I said facetiously. We shared a look and a grin. It's been really good to see you, Ash. I'm going to be in Denver frequently over the next few weeks. Here, it'll be nice to have a coffee and catch up. See how you're really doing, I said, handing her my card. Absolutely. Hey,
You best get down there. Looks like your partner won't let Professor Maddock get a word in," she said, looking down at the stage as Bodkin spat pure fire at Ruth Maddock, as she simply nodded along. He already scared off the most dangerous serial killer on the planet today with his big mouth. If I hang up here any longer, he'll scare her off as well. We shared a chuckle, said our goodbyes, and I jogged down the now empty steps towards Bodkins and Maddock. So anyway, I stood up, pointed at him, and told him, "You're not special, you're nothing." And he just loses it, starts crying like a little bitch, and storms out of the interview. You see, people like Cassidy think they're tough and dangerous, but really, they just need a man to stand up to them. Well, I'll give it to Bodkins. He really sold his serial killer spanking story well. Puffed his chest out like Superman and everything. So yeah, that's why we're here. We think it's wise that Agent Bodkins doesn't sit in the next interview because Robert Cassidy is absolutely freaking terrified of him, I joked. And Ruth Maddock's chuckle at my humor honestly made my knees melt. Bodkin's face turned to fury, but it is best to check himself and chuckle along with us to save face.
You must be Special Agent Quince? I've read about your arrest of Robert Cassidy. That was quite the achievement. I must say, it's an honor to meet you.
Ruth Maddock held out her hand, and I shook it gently. I smiled and modestly waved off her compliment. To be honest, Professor Maddock, I was second in command on that case. The hero behind that one is James Rodriguez. He's the one who put the profile together. I just helped. He's been reassigned to a more high-profile task force for the time being, and I won't lie, I feel a little out of my depth at the minute. So that's why we're here now, to ask if you'll help us, I said, honestly.
Help with what?
She asked. The, Showtime Ripper, or Killer, depending on which paper you read, I said bluntly. The professor seemed intrigued.
I must say, despite the awful nature of the crimes, they have fascinated me. I've been following the cases in the media,
she confessed. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff we've kept out of the media. If you agreed to be an official consultant with the FBI BSU, you'd have access to all of the case files. You could also help me interview Robert Cassidy, now that Bodkins is tagged out.
I'd have to rearrange my schedule with the university, but I'd love to. It would really aid with my research on child psychopathy and sadistic sexual fantasies in minors. Although, I must ask, what has Robert Cassidy got to do with this case?
She asked, curiously. Well, we left out a lot of details from the news. Just in case the unsub got in touch, we could verify his identity. And there were signs of cannibalism. Now, as you know, we haven't had a serial killer indulge in this sort of behavior since Dahmer. Not when in custody, anyway.
Can't you just type him from dental?
She asked. Well, we tried, but there's no matches on the database. When we catch him, though, we can use it to crucify him in court, I explained.
So you want to know why? Then maybe you'll know why STK does it.
Maddock asked.
I mean, I'm on board regardless. Robert Cassidy, he's the new Bundy. Girls don't know whether they should fear him or fuck him. I mean, I know girls like a bad boy, but I think he's a little extreme for my taste. Each to their own, I guess. But scientists have wanted to know about Cassidy's past and childhood ever since he was captured. No one knows who he was before the event. There's no record of him even being alive prior to 1994 when he was sent to a boarding school in Atlanta. Robert Cassidy was just the name he gave to Georgia Child Services when they found him walking the streets. Any insight into his background before this time would be a publisher's wet dream. Question is, do you think he'll talk to me?
Maddock asked. Yeah. Mainly because he'll want to eat you, I quipped. She didn't know whether to smile or wince.
Shall we head to my office? You can get me up to speed on the case.
Oh, by all means, I'll call the AD at Quantico, make it official, Bodkins declared as we all headed to Ruth Maddock's office. Bodkins and I sat patiently at one side of the desk, while Ruth Maddock went through each of the case files individually and scrupulously.
I did my absolute best not to spend the awkward silence fantasizing about myself and Ruth. It wasn't easy, though. My partner of 8 years had left me after I started on the CASSIDY task force. The late nights, the staring at photos of sexually mutilated girls all day, the stress, the paranoia, it all took its toll. Well, now I do the same job, but there's no one to go home and unload to. I couldn't help but admire how the professor could stare at the images and see it as simply a jigsaw that needed to be solved. I began to picture us getting married, becoming some sort of power couple who solved violent crimes through the day and made passionate love through the night. When suddenly her analysis caught me off guard.
I have a theory, but that's all it is right now,
She confessed. We leant forward to share our attentiveness.
Any history of abuse allegations or any involvement from social services?
Ruth asked. Balkin shook his head, confused by the question. In the families? He asked. Ruth nodded.
Yep, in all three.
I chipped in after scanning my mind. No, if anything, quite the opposite. Mother and father, stable marriage, kids did well at school. All of them went to church. Why do you ask?
I thought so. I believe the unsub is targeting families that dispute his belief of what a family should be. The way he singles out the mother with particular hatred suggests he has some sort of strained relationship with his own mother. Perhaps his mother was abusive towards him, or maybe even abandoned him. Seeing a loving mother with her perfect children could really rile him up. The photos of the families he takes will act as souvenirs. He can see them happy and embracing with love. Then he can relive what he did to them. It's something we've seen other similar killers do. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, would steal his victims' driver's licenses and jewelry so he could asphyxiate himself and relive the sexual gratification at a later point.
Well, the interview with Cassidy didn't last long at all, but he did mention something about wanting the mother to feel helpless. Balkins interjected. Yeah, dehumanize was the word he used, I added.
Really? Gosh, that is an interesting choice of vocabulary. You know, most people who suffer from ASPD, their detachment from empathy starts from a distant relationship with the mother. Our mothers are meant to sing us lullabies when we can't sleep and kiss our scraped knees when we fall down. They show us care and compassion. Someone who spends their childhood being deprived of that has much more risk of developing a detachment from human emotion and values.
Ruth began to venture. So our unsub didn't get enough hugs and kisses. Well, it seems a bit of an extreme reaction, to be honest, Balkins jeered. Yeah, I'm sure there's more to it. This is something we'll have to press Cassidy about, I said, taking a note in my jotting pad.
I agree. We need to find out what happened in his past that caused him to hate attractive and successful women so much that he wanted to destroy their bodies to such an extreme extent. It could help us see what makes our unsub choose his victims.
I'll contact Perkins at Florence, see if Cassidy is willing to talk again. Well, fingers crossed, we didn't exactly end on good terms, I dwelt. Ruth Maddock flashed a mischievous grin and chuckled.
Tell him that I will be coming. Make a point of my credentials and position. He won't be able to resist. He'll want to fantasize about what sadistic things he'd do to me, and he can't do that unless he sees me. Trust me, it'll work,
she said confidently. If you say so, I'll give you a call when I hear something, I said, reaching across the desk to shake hands with Miss Maddock.
Look forward to it,
she said with that smile that melted my insides. She didn't make a point of doing it. It just felt so genuine, not obligatory, almost like she couldn't help it. I don't know whether it was how she smiled at everyone, but it just felt like I had some depth to it. Well, Balkins went green with envy and barged in to break it up. Yeah, always lovely to see you, Ruth. So glad we're going to be working together again. He held out his hand and offered an embrace. She shook his hand for a brief second and barely made eye contact. I caught a smile that was slipping out.
I look forward to working with you both. Thank you for thinking of me, David,
Ruth said, genuinely. We welcomed her and left the university. The rest of the day was spent getting a motel for myself and Bodkins in Denver. Bodkins liaised with Perkins from Florence, and Ruth was right. Perkins told Cassidy an attractive and successful criminologist wanted to visit to interview him, and he was intrigued to say the least. The interview was set for 11 a.m. in 2 days' time. Bodkins and I were going through the case files when the phone rang. I answered it. It was Deputy Director Ray. Evening, sir. What can I do? I was cut off almost instantly. How quickly can you be in Wichita? He asked intensely. 2-3 hours. Why, sir? My question was met with a brief pause of silence followed by a sigh. You struck again, Peter. Part 5. Thankfully, I arrived in Park City rather quickly. By the time I got to Denver International, there was a plane just about to take off. I hopped on, and 100 or so minutes later, I was firing up my rental car and heading to the address in South Wichita. Bodkins stayed in Denver, transcribing the Cassidy interview, going through the evidence files, and liaising with Ruth Maddock, and so on. All the while waiting for me to trust him with something more important and make amends for his actions yesterday. I pulled up across the street from 231 Charleston Drive. There were already emergency services on the scene. Wichita PD, ambulances, Kansas State Coroner's Office, and now me, the sole representative of the FBI. I approached the officer in charge, which was Deputy Officer Jim Meller. I flashed my badge and introduced myself. Special Agent Peter Quince, Behavioral Science Unit. I'm heading up the task force assigned to profiling the unsub responsible for the home invasions. Jim Meller looked too young to be heading up something this high profile. His pasty face and scrawny frame looked like he had much more growing to do, but he had to be at least 22. Well, I simply guessed it was down to poor staff numbers at Wichita PD. Good evening, Agent. Glad to have you on the scene. Do you have any idea of who we should be looking for? The deputy asked. I didn't feel like telling him that I had absolutely jack shit. Well, I've just been assigned. It's early days, but we're looking for a white male, 25 to 35. Someone with a history of sexual abuse. He's likely strong from bodybuilding or perhaps trained in combat sports. Maybe he's served in some sort of military or emergency service. Doesn't mind breaking into a house with another adult male in it. All the men were mid-30s, no more than 175 pounds, average height. He's slightly taller and heavier than the men, but not so much he'd be intimidating. He's potentially worked near the houses before because he's got a good idea of how to get in without making too much noise. I gave him pretty broad strokes. This was basic stuff. I had no idea who we were looking for. Who are the deceased? I asked. The Bensons. Lived here for years. No history of domestic or sexual abuse with child services. Didn't even drink. The father, Joseph, 38, was tortured before he died from severe blood loss, after his genitals were removed. The 3 kids, Beverly, 16, Ashley, 12, Michael, 8, all died from strangulation. And then the mom, Wendy. The deputy took a minute to gather himself. He almost winced, but caught himself and apologized for not remaining professional. It's fine, Deputy. You're doing great. Are you local? I asked, empathetically. He nodded in spite of his emotions. Oh, yes, sir. Benjamin Hills, born and bred, he said, proud of his hometown heritage. He added, Sorry, it's just we don't usually get things like this. Some of the vets at the station, they say they ain't seen a home invasion this disturbing since the Oteros, all the way back in 74. Well, that was way before my time, so this is your first time with this sort of thing? I once again asked, empathetically. He nodded, shamefully. I put a friendly hand on his shoulder, letting him know it was okay to be bothered by something like this. He picked up his chin, stiffened up his lip, and dusted himself off. Shall we go inside? Maybe it's best I just show you, the deputy suggested. I gestured for him to lead the way, and we began to make our way into the crime scene. There's always something about knowing a horrific thing has happened in the house that just makes the place feel darker. Like some sort of abyss into the depths of the underworld has formed in its very hallways. Any sign of forced entry? I asked, as we made our way through the corridors. Mella nodded cautiously. We think he got the window open in the kids' room. Why? You think they knew the killer? He asked. I didn't answer his question because, I didn't know what to tell him yet. Instead, I peered into the children's bedroom and saw what I was expecting to see. That's how he got in? I asked, gesturing towards the open window. We've had that in every house. Our theory is he finds a family, stalks a house, waits for the night when the children's window is open, sneaks in and does his thing. Stalks the house? The deputy probed. Yep. There was a large tree with sturdy branches that overlooked the garden at the first and third houses. Then there was a treehouse at the second. All the houses were single-story. Much easier to climb into and not make any noise when you don't need a ladder. So you don't think he knows the victims personally? Deputy Miller again asked, as we made our way to the master bedroom. If I had to answer at this point, then I don't think so. 4 sets of victims, all different states. Hard to see how he'd know each set of victims. At this moment, we believe he moves to different areas, maybe for an occupation, where they catch his eye somehow, and then the stalking begins, and then the attack, and then he moves on. I answered, as honestly as I could. The deputy seemed satisfied with the answer. We arrived at the master bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Inside, the flashing and snapping of a Polaroid camera was going on. This is Frank Adams. He's a freelance crime scene photographer, one of the best in the business. Frank, this is Special Agent Peter Quince from the Bureau, the deputy said, doing his utmost not to look at the horrific scene on the bed. Frank, however, a seasoned professional, rose to his feet and shook my hand firmly. Pleasure to meet you, Agent, although I think we've already met, he said with a smile. Same to you, Mr. Adams. Really? Have we? I returned, slightly shocked. Yeah, I've photographed all the murder scenes so far. You came to the DeVille house last week. I guess us forensic workers all look the same, huh? He joked. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I feel so rude. Nothing like a hacked-up family to make you lose your manners, eh? I apologized genuinely. I didn't like the stuck-up federal agent reputation that some law enforcers stuck us with. That's fine. You'll know for next time, won't you? He said, slapping a friendly hand on my shoulder. Or anyway, I'm almost finished. Then I'll be out of your hair. Just need to photograph Mrs. Benson, he added, getting back into position with his camera. Oh, go right ahead, I invited. Frank Adams smiled and snapped 4 photos of the victim, put the Polaroid photos into an evidence bag and began to leave the room. I caught him. Before you leave, could you give me a rundown of the crime scene? I asked. He put his equipment down on the dressing table and gestured for me to follow him. In my opinion, the unsub entered here, through the window, attacked the children in their beds and subdued them. As he spoke, I made notes. We found this on one of the boys, he said, showing a Polaroid depicting a nasty-looking flesh wound on the oldest child's ribs. If I had to guess, I'd say a pair of pliers. Use them to make the child groan in pain. Unsub hid behind the door, waited for Mr. Benson to enter in haste. Judging by the external bruising on Mr. Benson's neck, I'd guess a rear chokehold. Mrs. Benson was then at his mercy, he said, holding back a wince. He led us back to the master bedroom then. As you can see, the children were lined up against the east side wall, watching as the unsub raped, tortured, and mutilated the victim, ante-mortem and post-mortem. Once the deed was over, he killed the children by asphyxiating them. Father was also tortured and murdered. As soon as Frank had finished his walkthrough, something caught my ear. Wait, the husband was tortured, I asked, scanning my mind back to the other cases. Frank looked caught off guard by my question. Yeah, not what you were expecting? He asked. Well, last 3 adult male victims showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head, likely to subdue them. And they all died in the same manner as the children, knife wound to the throat. Genitals were removed on the last victim, but that was done post-mortem, I informed. Frank looked at me curiously. But in this case, the husband was tortured just as much as the wife, and the castration occurred ante-mortem. Loss of blood being the cause of death, I added. You thinking he's changing his M.O.? Frank smiled as if to say, great minds think alike, as his question was phrased as more of a statement. Maybe. Part of me thinks this wasn't even the same killer, I said, extravagantly with a bit of a chuckle. Mellor and Adams eyed me curiously. I gestured that I would provide a reason behind my theory. There's a lot more blood on the sheets than the previous 3 victims, indicating that the victim was tortured more ante-mortem than post-mortem. The victim's missing parts of her flesh, but it's been done with blades and pliers. The other victims were bitten. Look at the signs of extreme violence inflicted. It's a complete next level to the other victims. The others were about control and power. This was about hate and anger. It's a similar scene, but the M.O. is totally different. I analyzed this as I scanned the rest of the house. The deputy and the photographer followed me eagerly. Anything missing from the home? I asked. The deputy looked at me and the photographer with a confused look on his face and asked, No, like what? Like a family photo. There was a photo taken from the home in all previous cases. The deputy pouted and began to shake his head, but looked at Frank Adams for confirmation. The photographer backed him up. No, nothing like that. You see, we're operating on the assumption he takes a photo of the family as a trophy. Nothing been taken from the scene, so... what is he using as a souvenir? Well, I was asking anyone who could muster an answer. Frank Adams seemed curious about the criminal mind. He was like the star pupil who always put up his hand in class. What's the purpose of the trophies? Why are they important to the unsolved? Adams asked. Violent, sexually motivated criminals commit their acts to feel the sexual gratification they can't achieve in their normal lives. It's not easy planning a kill. A lot of work goes into it. It can be a lengthy process, so to give them a release in the meantime, they relive what they've done by revisiting the scene of their crimes. If they can't do that, though, then the trophies can tide them over. So they are extremely important. I'm really surprised that nothing's missing. Well, my speech began to become more of a thinking pattern that was being spoken. Frank Adams took this opportunity to make his exit. Right, anyway, I best get these photos into evidence. I'll make sure to get you a copy of my report, Agent Quince. Pleasure to meet you. He shook my hand firmly once again. Don't worry, we'll get them, he said with a wink. I smiled back. Yeah, I hope so. Frank Adams left, and I was left with the green as grass Deputy Mellor. He didn't seem to be able to stomach much more of the scene. I let him go back to door duty while I rewalked the scene a few more times. Once I'd made notes, recordings, and took photos, I decided to make my way back to Denver. Nothing much else I could do here. I've got everything I need, Deputy. I'm heading back to Denver. Maybe we'll meet again, I said. Really? You think you'll be back? He replied, still clearly shaken by it all. Well, hopefully, we have a project going on right now where we are researching similar offenders to our own sub. Once we're happy with the findings, we'll present a profile to local law enforcement to aim their efforts. So Wichita PD could be one of those departments, I informed him. Jim Mellor smiled. Well, hope so. We get a lot of feds coming down here, acting like their shit don't stink. You've been really understanding to my inexperience. It's been a pleasure meeting you, he said, genuinely. He shook my hand, much less firm than the photographer. I put that down to his age, personality, and experience. I'm pretty new to this stuff too, I confessed.
Thankfully, I shadowed one of the best agents in the Bureau when we worked on the CASSIDY case. I've got a degree, but if I'm honest, I learned everything I know from that, I added. My point is, my training wheels haven't been off as long as you'd think, so I know exactly how you feel. But going to 20 crime scenes of violence and rape does make you a little desensitized to it all. And you'll get used to it, I assured him. He scoffed. Not sure I ever want to become a person who's used to shit like that, he confided. I nodded gently in reply, knowing exactly what he meant. I managed to just about catch the red-eye back to Colorado. A few hours of flying and tedious driving later, I was carefully trying to open my motel room door quietly, doing my utmost not to wake Bodkins. I crawled into the other twin bed and curled up facing the wall, drifting off into a shallow 4-hour sleep, all the while dreaming of home invaders and violent rapists. What a life. I barely seemed to have my eyes shut for more than 20 seconds before Bodkins was shaking me awake. I sat up groggy as he passed me an instant coffee that he prepared himself. Thanks, I mustered. Get that down your neck. We'll grab some breakfast and you can tell me everything, Bodkins exclaimed, throwing back the drapes and allowing the Colorado sun to beam into my face. I squinted purposely, signaling to Bodkins that a bit of warning would have been preferred. There was a nice little diner just down the road from my motel. Full buffet and bottomless coffee for $5.99 seemed an absolute steal. We parked up in the booth at the back of the establishment, away from prying eyes and eavesdropping ears. So, is it him? Bodkins asked, shoving a piece of toast into his mouth. Not sure, I answered, as I stared vacantly into my breakfast, pushing a piece of bacon into the egg yolk. Bodkins stopped chewing long enough to cock his head in puzzlement. But D.D. Ray said that... It was very similar. Unsub came through the window, subdued the kids, lured the husband into an attack, made them watch the mother's ordeal, then killed the witnesses. I laid it out for him. So, what are the differences then? He asked, intrigued. Well, the main victim wasn't left in the same hog roast position. Just laid on her back. The wounds were all inflicted with instruments rather than teeth. She had all sorts of wounds to her skin and flesh. All the sodomy and destruction of her reproductive organs occurred when she was alive. I didn't even think she'd been raped. I've requested an autopsy to confirm. Additionally, the husband had also been tortured, arguably just as much as the wife. He'd been sodomized as well with one of the children's toys. Oh, and the children. Throats weren't slit. They'd been asphyxiated. Well, the scene is the same, but the details are so different. Oh, there were no photos taken. I decided to leave it there as I could see Bodkins was struggling to keep up. Yeah, sorry, it's been a long night, I added. Or maybe he's just changing his MO. Wouldn't be the first time a killer did that to throw off the investigators, would it? Bodkins pondered. Well, I guess not, but... I sighed with hesitancy. There's using a knife instead of a gun, or dumping a body in the woods instead of the lake, but... well, this was different. The level of violence inflicted was to cause serious agony. It wasn't to humiliate or dehumanize. This was out of serious hate. I don't know. It's all mixed up in my head, I said, taking a huge gulp of coffee. Maybe just take the morning. Relax your mind. Wait for the reports to come through from Wichita PD. It'll make more sense, Bodkins said, sounding like the occupational therapist at Quantico. Maybe you're right, I said with a sigh of acceptance. Anyway, Ruth wanted us to head up to the university again today. Make up a questionnaire for the CASSIDY interview. Plus, she's intrigued to hear about the Bensons. Okay, let's finish our food and get our files and we'll head up, I told Bodkins, finishing the last of my coffee. And we shoved the rest of the bacon in our mouths, got a refill for the road, and made our way back to the hotel. Bodkins played the good soldier and took the scenic route to the university,
allowing me to have a much-needed power nap in the passenger seat. I couldn't help but feel conscious about my appearance as we made our way to Ruth Maddock's office. I was hoping I didn't look too tired before scolding myself for thinking like a 15-year-old schoolboy. When we entered the office, Ruth was just finishing marking her students' papers.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are we?
She asked, her bubbliness that of a person who had had at least 8 hours sleep. I envied her. Ready to get into it, Bodkins exclaimed. Ready to get into bed, I confessed. Ruth chuckled.
Yeah, I can see. You just get back from Wichita?
5 a.m., I said, causing her to wince for me. I smiled in return, appreciating her making me feel at ease. I could see Bodkins going green with envy out of the corner of my eye as we shared the moment, and I grinned even more.
So we can add the Bensons to the list of victims of the Showtime killer?
She asked, objectively, looking through the files I'd placed on her desk. Quincy's not sure, Bodkins chirped up. Ruth shot her head up to look at me with surprise.
Really?
She asked. Wichita thinks he's just changed his MO to stay ahead of the police. But there's just something that doesn't sit with me. I mean, go ahead and look at my notes and give me your opinion, I invited, waving my palm out towards the files. Ruth's expression told me she was accepting the invitation, and we then waited patiently for her expert opinion. Around 20 minutes later, she closed the file, knocked the papers back into a neat pile against her desk, and bluntly said,
I agree. This isn't him.
Bodkins and I both looked up in surprise. Well, Bodkins was more confused, whereas I was more relieved. I knew I wasn't reading too much into it. You really think so? I asked, fishing for confirmation.
Absolutely. It'll be interesting to see the autopsy report. I'll lay you good odds that she wasn't raped.
She sounded confident. I was intrigued. I gave Bodkins a I told you so grin. What makes you say that? Bodkins probed. I pulled my chair forward to show my interest.
The first 3 victims were beaten, raped, and stabbed. The bites to the flesh, stab wounds, and the insertion of foreign objects into the anus and vagina was all done post-mortem. Whereas here, our unsub not only doesn't take the trophy, but he tortures Mrs. Benson sadistically. He tears her flesh with the pliers, cuts her, stabs her, burns her, violates, penetrates, and sodomizes her with the bedpost. All this is done ante-mortem. He does the same with Mr. Benson, too, destroys his flesh with the hardware, then castrates him and sodomizes him with a children's toy as he lays bleeding to death. Then the children have been asphyxiated, not lacerated. Look at the bruising on the tip of the noses.
She pointed at the photo which depicted a close-up of the children's faces. Bodkins and I looked in closely, remaining professional and hiding our contempt for whatever monster had done this. Well, say what you want about Robert Cassidy, but he never harmed a child.
I read the reports on the first 3 victims. The children had their throats sliced, but the pathologist reports indicate the unsub was right-handed, and the wounds were inflicted from left to right. But here, that bruising indicates the killer used a bag and applied the pressure from behind, meaning...
I didn't want to look at him, I answered out loud, following Ruth's thought pattern.
Exactly. The first 3 victims were all made to look into their killer's eyes when he slit their throats.
Ruth explained. Well, not exactly the behavior of the Showtime killer. The killer who loves an audience, Bodkins said, finally starting to get on board.
I think this was someone with a grudge and dressed it up to make it look like the work of a high-profile murderer. This is below our radar, if you ask me. If STK is out there, then he's planning another murder soon. The hot nights are coming to an end soon. Less people leaving their windows open. He'll have to make a move soon.
Ruth speculated, just as my phone pinged, signifying I had an email.
Well, you were right. Pathologist's report just came through. No signs of conventional rape, I informed her.
Could you forward the reports from Wichita to my email? I'd like to go over them in my own time, if that's okay.
Ruth asked. I gestured I was happy to do it and sent on the documents.
Is anything on why none of the victims managed to call the police?
Ruth questioned. Well, the first 3 houses, all the phone lines were cut, so they couldn't use the landlines. However, it's 2017. Why wouldn't they use their mobiles, right? Well, I did a bit of digging into complaints to cell phone companies on the nights of the murders in the surrounding area. There's a spike in complaints to each of the top providers around the times of the murders from the neighboring streets. I think he uses a signal blocker, I hypothesized.
Fair assumption,
Ruth admitted, giving me a look of awe and admiration. I couldn't help perk up in my seat. So, what are we doing about Cassidy? Bodkins asked, his jealous side desperately trying to change the subject.
Well, I've made up a first draft questionnaire that I want both your inputs on, Ruth
informed, pulling a piece of paper out of her desk. She began to go through the bullet points and what she wanted to obtain from Cassidy. Meanwhile, I started to daydream and stare at the map of the USA on the office wall. 3rd murder, Nebraska. 2nd murder, Oklahoma. 1st murder, Texas. I began to speak out loud, waiting for someone to catch on to my train of thoughts. 4th murder, Wichita. They make a line, but they're not in order, I continued. Do you not think that's a little strange? I asked. Ruth began to see what I was talking about.
I really don't think it's an accident that all these states are neighboring. Imagine you are a serial killer. You know if your name turns up on flight records to other states in patterns around a murder timeline, you know it's going to lead them to you, sooner or later. So you drive to a neighboring city, commit your crime, then move on to the next.
Ruth speculated. When Cassidy killed his victims, he never killed anyone in Texas while he lived there, I added. So, maybe he left out Kansas because it's a little too close to home? Bodkins joined in. Or maybe it is his home, I thought out loud again.
But then why go back and do the murder there anyway?
Ruth proposed. Well, I thought we were assuming this wasn't our guy, I challenged. And this made Bodkins and Ruth meet my gaze, and you could hear everyone's gears in their head begin to turn.
It's important we don't get tunnel vision here. This pattern could be purely coincidental,
Ruth reminded us. Well, I'll request a background check on the Bensons. Maybe it'll give us the information we need, I said, pulling out my phone and making a call to Wichita PD. The phone rang a few times before a female voice answered. Good morning, Wichita Police Department. Desk Sergeant Rosie Conwell speaking, a friendly voice said. Good morning, Sergeant Conwell. It's Special Agent Peter Quince from the Behavioral Science Unit at the FBI. I consulted on one of your crime scenes last night and... The Bensons? She asked bluntly, cutting me off. Yes, that's correct. I'd like to request a background check on the deceased, if I may. I politely requested. I'll consult the officer on the scene, then I'll put it together and forward it on to you, she told me. Ah yes, Deputy Meller. I've met him. Nice guy, I informed her. She took my email and told me I'd have the report within the next 24 hours. I thanked her and hung up. We should know more by tomorrow morning at latest, I informed the group.
Okay then, let's get back to Mr. Cassidy,
Ruth said, clicking her pen and gesturing back towards the questionnaire, preparing for what would no doubt be a taxing interview tomorrow. Part 6. Ruth Maddock, despite her years studying violent sex offenders and likely taking part in multiple prisoner research projects, well, you could tell she was extremely unsettled and daunted by the procedures at Florence and especially our descent into the hole. You just know whoever's down here is the worst of the worst. I imagine this is what descending into the underworld would feel like.
Perkins led us to the same interview room as before, gave us a hand setting up the recording equipment before leaving the room to fetch the prisoner.
"You okay?"
he asked Ruth softly. Her demeanor was the most vulnerable that I'd seen in the brief time I'd known her. It was a strange sight.
"Yeah, I'm fine,"
she said, shrugging it off. I knew what was bothering her, though.
"Just keep to your questionnaire.
Don't let him get you talking about you or your personal life. Any questions relating to investigations, I'll field. It's going to be intense, but you'll do fine. I know it," I assured her. She gave me another gorgeous smile, and we shared a stare that honestly made me forget that we were there. And then, the door buzzed, and just like the lock on the door, we were snapped out of our moments. We turned to face the glass. Robert Cassidy was forced down into his seat and had the sack removed from his head. His chains were fastened to the table once again, and the guards gave a thumbs up to the camera in the corner of the room, signaling to Perkins that he wasn't going anywhere. Cassidy gave me a forced and sarcastic smile.
"Good morning, Agent. Nice to see you again."
He turned his smarmy grin to Ruth. I saw his eyes light up and his pupils pin. His grin became more of a sinister and hungry smile, and I swear he bit his lip.
"And you must be the renowned and brilliant Professor Ruth Maddock,"
Cassidy said, mouth moving. Everything else remained frozen in place. It was truly unnerving, but Ruth, being the strong, professional woman she is, handled it well.
"Yes, very nice to meet you, Mr. Cassidy. How are you today?"
she asked calmly. He didn't flinch. His eyes just bored holes into her soul. A few tense moments passed before suddenly he blinked a few times, relaxed his features, and calmly replied with,
"The pleasure's all mine, Professor. Can't complain too much, for a man who hasn't seen much daylight in over 8 months, anyway. Well, who knows?
The offer I made still stands. You give us what we need, then maybe I can get you moved back into Side A. You'll still be on 23-hour lockdown, but you'll get yard time and social interaction. Hell, I'll push for extra privileges like TV and gym." I laid all the cards on the table for Cassidy.
"Well then, let's get to it.
Got a busy day ahead," he said facetiously. Ruth cleared her throat.
"Thank you, Mr. Cassidy."
"Please, call me Robert,"
Cassidy instructed Ruth. She composed herself once again and restarted.
"Thank you, Robert. I, along with Special Agent Quince, are grateful for your cooperation in this process. Your answers, responses, and insights will be used in conjunction with current and future FBI assignments. In addition to this, the transcripts will be available to academic and research purposes in the field of criminology, forensic psychology, and psychopathy. None of your answers, responses, or insights can be used against you in any applications or appeals for parole."
As Ruth read from the document, Cassidy raised his eyebrows.
"Spoken like a true bureaucrat,"
Cassidy quipped. Ruth ignored his comment.
"I'd like to start with some questions into your childhood. So what I would—"
Her approach was quickly shut down by Cassidy tutting and shaking his head.
"When I was told a brilliant, amazing, well-renowned female professor who makes every man she meets quiver like a little schoolboy, well, I expected more."
His pupils dropped for a millisecond to Ruth's hands before flashing back up into position, back boring into her soul.
"Oh, no ring, I see. What's the matter, Ruth? On the surface, you look like every man's dream. What's underneath, though? Paranoia? Insecurities? You come in here hiding under your Versace blazer, strutting in your $700 heels so you can barely walk in, armed with your Prada handbag like every other sad stereotype, desperately trying to prove to everyone she's something she's not. Even your questions are predictable. Was your degree awarded from some rural community college in the middle of Inbredville, Georgia? You want my advice? Get some fucking originality and stop wasting my fucking time with your tedious and generic examination."
Cassidy had some venom behind his words, but he looked like his steady pulse never even flickered. I expected Ruth to be rattled. Cassidy had a skill of smelling out your insecurities and putting them on show, all for you to feel at your most vulnerable. I felt awkward for her, to be honest. But as I turned my head to give her a look of reassurance, I saw she was smiling.
Wow, your reputation precedes you, Robert. You really are the monster you're made out to be,
she said, like a zoologist admiring the last of an endangered species. She placed the questionnaire back in her bag and clasped her hands together.
Work likes everything procedural. I don't,
she said, pulling the tie from her hair and letting her blonde red locks flow onto her shoulders. Cassidy's mouth opened ever so slightly and his cheeks tensed even more subtly in the beginnings of a devilish grin.
Oh, now you're talking,
he said intensely. Ruth flashed her pearly whites in response. Well, I just sat there, in awe, quite frankly.
I sensed a real disdain a moment there when you were giving your opinion on me. Care to explain those feelings in a more contextual manner?
She asked, clearly and confidently.
Do you have children, Ruth?
Cassidy asked, ignoring her question with a question.
No.
Her answer honest and calm.
Why not?
He probed.
I don't think with my schedule at the university and everything else that I'd have time to raise a family.
Cassidy didn't seem impressed with her answer. He shook his head in disapproval.
You know what your appearance says to me? It tells me that you've been with the wrong man at one point in your life. Oh, the fiery red hair, telling the men you meet that you have passion. You can handle yourself. War paint, if you will. The overpriced clothes. Trying to intimidate your potential partners. The Ivy League strut, telling any white trash wife-beaters that you're smarter than they are. I watched you from my cell when you came through. The way you stumble every 5 steps in those 6-inch heels tells me you haven't had years of experience wearing them. Yet you've been a professor for clearly over 10 years. You didn't always dress like this. Something changed you. It was a man, wasn't it? What did he do to you, Ruth? What was so bad that you went from little geeky science lover Ruthie all the way to sexy intellectual Professor Murdoch? Adultery? Alcohol? Abuse?
Look, you really don't need to answer. But my concern was cut short by Ruth answering defiantly.
Yes, you're right. He used to beat me,
she snapped. Cassidy smiled. His demeanor changed, however. He seemed less hostile towards her now.
Honesty, it's a good trait in a woman. Not something I see often,
Cassidy said with a shake of his head and a slight taunt.
Please, continue, Ruth.
My first long-term boyfriend was violent toward me. I just began to study my master's in criminal psychology at Princeton and was living in New Jersey at the time. He was from Asbury Park and we'd met at a bar. I was a young, inexperienced, education-obsessed geek. The fact this attractive and mysterious bad boy was trying to seduce me, it really brought out the 14-year-old girl in me who never had a boy even want to kiss me. I fell for every line he threw my way,
she confessed. Cassidy playing the role of a therapist, nodding his head.
What did he do? Must have been pretty bad, Ruthie,
he probed.
Started out by stealing money from my student loans to pay for his drug debts. He brought trouble to our door. He'd spend all hours of the night, up to God knows what. I was struggling with working to pay for the house, balancing 2 jobs with my studies. He'd refuse to work or repay any of the money he took from me.
But something worse happened, though, didn't it?
Ruth nodded. I once again expressed my misgivings about opening up any further, but her gestures insisted that she was fine.
I became pregnant at 20. I didn't tell him at first, but eventually I did, hoping it would be the kick up the ass he needed to grow up.
Well, then what, Ruthie? Then what?
Cassidy probed again.
I was 5 months pregnant. He came home from a 3-day bender. Over $2,000 was taken from my savings, and I screamed at him, telling him he was a waste of space.
Oh, and how dare you, eh?
Cassidy asked, provocatively.
He knocked me to the ground and began kicking my stomach like a sandbag, until there was nothing left inside. Then he moved on to my face.
A tiny tear escaped from Ruth's eye, as in that moment she was clearly back on that kitchen floor. Cassidy reveled for a few seconds in the torment he'd caused before getting to his point.
But you did the right thing, didn't you? You didn't stick around, now did you?
He probed. Ruth shook her head.
Doctors told me I'd suffered severe hemorrhaging and I'd miscarried. I told them what happened. The police were involved, and he spent 3 years in prison for aggravated assault. By the point he was released, I'd moved to Denver to take part in the university's research and teaching projects.
Her admission was met with approval by Cassidy. Had his hands not been shackled to his torso, I think he would have actually applauded her.
Well, I respect that, truly I do. Hence why I'll always have respect for my wife, Amy,
he admitted. Ex-wife, I corrected, earning a death stare from Cassidy.
Hence why I'll always respect my ex-wife.
She found out what I was and she acted. She did what she had to do to protect her children. Like you did, Ruthie.
You didn't stick around and bring a child into that toxic relationship. I mean, who knows what would have happened if you didn't?
Maybe it would have been your own flesh and blood hacking up families in the Midwest. Cassidy speculated with a shrug and a pout.
Pardon me, Robert, but I'd like to explore that, if I may.
And Cassidy gestured that the floor was hers.
You hinted there that you believe a child being brought into an abusive home would be a large indicator he'd go on to commit heinous acts of violence. Is that what happened to you, Robert?
Ruth probed. Cassidy examined her for a moment. I think he appreciated her honesty and she'd earned some of his respect. And he decided to answer.
I think there was always something not quite right there with me, to be perfectly honest. From the minute I could form memories, I remember feeling pain every day. I never understood why until I realized it was being inflicted by the man I called father. Cigarette burns, bare fists, tied to radiators while they were turned on. I just thought it was playtime like everyone else. I mean, my father certainly seemed to enjoy it. Maybe it was the booze, or maybe he just liked hurting me, who knows. Either way, that was mine and my father's bonding time. It was like he was teaching me to fish or ride a bike, he said, a touch of dark humor. We allowed him to continue. Meanwhile, on the other hand, I never bonded with my mother. She tried to breastfeed me, and I'd end up biting her, more often than not drawing blood. I can't explain why, it just felt good having my turn inflicting the pain for a change. Cassidy's answer was very self-observant. He'd be the ideal therapist client.
Sigmund Freud believed there were 5 stages of psychosexual development. Trauma, known or not, in the early years can lead to an oral fixation when it comes to self-soothe and pleasure. Most people become smokers or bite their nails, but in extreme cases, that may, amongst other factors, explain your fixation with eating flesh.
Freud. Very original, he scoffed.
Whether he's too mainstream for your liking or not, it's irrelevant. He's that for a reason, because his theories are wild and out there, but they have substance. Can you tell me about how life at home as a child developed for you as you matured?
Ruth probed further.
As I aged and started school, I started to realize I wasn't like other children. I'd be asked about scars, bruises, and cuts by teachers. Kids would pick on me for the way I looked and smelled. You know the story. Anyway, I remember this one time I came into school. One of the bullies knocks my books on the floor. I bend to pick it up, and as I extend my arm, my sleeve rides up. The teacher sees the ligature marks on my wrist, cigarette burns on my forearms, She gasps. My mother gets a visit from child welfare, and by this point I knew my father was a bad person. I was expecting her to tell them what he was doing to me. I thought she'd get them to make him stop, but she didn't. She didn't? I asked, almost sympathetically. No, Agent Quince, she did not. In fact, she told them it was me who was the bad one. Told them I liked to play rough with other kids in the neighborhoods, that I ignore her warnings and run near the stairs, and sometimes I trip. She also told them I was a problem child, and showed them the bite marks on her skin. We have to remember this was a time where children could be struck at school and it was okay. Ah, what a performance. They fucking ate it up. That night, Father returned home and gave me the hazing of a lifetime. All the while, Mother just watched and said nothing. I lay on the floor, bleeding, aching. Father started taking his belt off and began to unfasten his trousers. I looked up at my mother and begged her to make him stop. Begged him not to do what I guessed he was gonna do. She didn't move a muscle, as he pulled my trousers down and pushed me face into the mattress. Do you know what she said? We both shook our heads. Well, I've got to get to work. Have fun, guys, Cassidy said, impersonating a happy housewife voice. She was a secretary for an accountant downtown. Boss made her work all sorts of hours. All she could do to bring some money home for food, rent, and Father's addictions. All the while I was dehumanized by Father, every night without fail, till I was old enough to make him stop. Dehumanized? That's the word you used in our first interview, I pointed out. Yes, it is, isn't it? Cassidy said, rhetorically, with a purposeful smile.
Please, Agent Quince, if I may, I'd like to continue with Robert's childhood. We will revisit key points in a short while, okay?
Ruth requested. I nodded and gestured for her to go ahead.
How did it make you feel when your father abused you? And how did it make you feel when your mother turned a blind eye?
She asked. Cassidy sat back, staring vacantly through the glass into Ruth's eyes.
I didn't feel anything. Not emotionally, anyway. I just felt like I was being abandoned, disrespected.
Strange feelings for a child,
Ruth pointed out.
Well, I was a strange child. I just knew a father was not meant to beat and rape his son, and I knew mothers are meant to protect their young at all costs. So it angered me she didn't. She knew the damage Father was doing, but she was too fucking weak to do anything about it. She'd concentrate on her career and bury her head in the sand, all the while I was getting brutalized and sodomized like clockwork. But hey, at least she's making money, right? He added sarcastically.
Is that why you targeted women of childbearing ages who were successful from a professional or academic point of view? Because they reminded you of your mother gallivanting around while you were at home being raped?
She asked. Cassidy decided not to answer that, but his shrug told us everything we needed to know.
Okay, moving on, you alluded that you made your father stop once you were old enough. Care to elaborate on that?
Ruth probed.
People look at me like I'm a monster, but I imagine anyone who was treated the way I was would be somewhat emotionally distant. I always knew I wasn't the sort of person who'd get easily attached, shall we say. But maybe with all parents, I'd have been what you academics call a successful psychopath. You know, like a banker or a politician or something. But no, I knew I was going to be something else, because, well, if there's one thing Father taught me well, it was how to be a fucking monster.
We both sat quiet and let Cassidy continue.
Around the age of 12, I started to realize when it came to sexual fantasies, I was into women, or girls, should I say. However, I was a typical smelly, bruised, scruffy child who could barely walk in a straight line from being raped daily, so it's fair to say I couldn't approach any girl that took my eye.
So how did this affect you?
Ruth probed.
I did what any other pubescent child would. I turned to pornography, Started off with the usual stuff, but started to soon realize that I liked the videos where the woman was being completely ravished, the man totally in control. I liked to see her hair nearly pulled from the root, her back arched from the force. I liked it when they cried. I liked it when they bled. The videos I sought out began to become much more extreme. Leg spreaders, shackles, ball gags. The screams more from pain than pleasure.
So then your tastes, they escalated, didn't they? Even further?
Ruth pushed. Oh yes, the videos I liked to watch became extremely violent. Women beaten, tied up, raped, violated, sodomized against their will. Some of them even killed after. Those were my favorites. The way their eyes bulged and the veins in their neck pulsated as they screamed in sheer agony. And they started to shape my views on women and sex.
So what became of your mother and father?
Ruth asked. The man I knew as father spent so much of his evenings raping, drinking, and using that when it came to the daytime, he just wanted to sleep. Conveniently, he was a smoker. I was quite bright for my age. It just took a few of those fire safety commercials warning people not to smoke in bed or when you're tired on the couch before the idea formulated in my head. Bottle of whiskey still in his hands, needle hanging from the arm. The prig made it so easy. Even when the flames caught to his skin, he didn't wake up. Bit of a disappointment, to be honest, but by the time the fire department arrived and the house was caving in on him, I heard his whimper turn into a groan. That made me happy. I remember smiling at that, because it was enough for me to know he could feel it.
What about your mother?
Ruth asked. She returned to find I'd done what she was too fucking weak to do. I got rid of him. Did I get a thank you, though? No. She just showed me that I was right about them both. After the fire, we moved out of state. She'd leave me at home, alone. No food in the cupboards. No water coming through the pipes. Nothing to wipe my fucking ass with. Without father, Mother turned to the old bottle herself. Except her sexual drive from the booze didn't affect me directly. She spent her nights out at bars, picking up anyone who'd give her a sniff of attention. My disdain for her grew and grew, to the point where I wanted to do something about her too. Well, don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed killing father, but it was via proxy. The flames did the work, and I just facilitated.
So what did you do?
Ruth probed, the tension of the conversation rising. I decided I was gonna feel this one. Age 15, she came home one night alone. She climbed into bed and began to drift off. I followed her in, creeping quietly. In my hand, the barbed wire I'd extracted from a farmer's fence earlier that day. Ruth and I just looked on in horror as Cassidy began smiling, like he was reminiscing about a fun family vacation. Oh, it's strange, isn't it? You mentioned Freud, and I do believe he hypothesized that sons secretly fantasize about being sexual with their own mothers, but they stop through fear of the father finding out. Yeah, that was him, wasn't it? Cassidy asked. Ruth nodded.
The Oedipus complex, yes.
She confirmed. Cassidy grinned. Well, there was no father around to scare me off anymore, he said coldly. Neither of us wanted to ask what came next. Unfortunately, we didn't have to, as Cassidy was more than happy to tell us. I wanted her to know what it was like. To be hurt, brutalized, to be fucking raped by your own flesh and blood. And no one is gonna fucking help you. Cassidy's cold calmness was now building to an incensed rage. His mouth was beginning to froth.
Okay, this is clearly a raw subject for you. Maybe we should...
Ruth's attempt at easing the tension was interrupted by Cassidy. He wasn't finished. The way she looked into my eyes. Most victims look at their attacker with pleading eyes, don't they? Why are you doing this? And why me? She didn't, though. No, she knew exactly why I was doing this. Instead, her eyes, for the first time in her fucking life, said, "Sorry." After that, I ran away. Far, far away.
Where did you go?
Ruth asked. Atlanta. Stole the last of my mother's petty cash. The only time her career came in handy to me. Got myself cleaned up and headed to the bus stop. Grabbed the first bus out of town. The bus driver was called Robert. There was a kid next to me reading a Spider-Man comic. In the issue, the villain was called Cletus Cassidy. He was a serial killer. Seemed fitting. What happened in Atlanta, then, under your new name? I asked. Things didn't go as smoothly as I expected. It wasn't long before I was spotted by some do-gooders and reported to child services. Before I knew it, I was taken into the foster care system. At the start, I was passed from pillar to post, for a few months trying to find somewhere long-term. No one ever wanted to keep me, though. I think people knew I was never going to be normal. I had a caseworker who persevered with me, however. Nice guy. I'd been acing the SATs and the IQ test at the local high school. I was in the 99th percentile for anything they gave me. Maths, science, English, you name it. He put in a referral for sending me to a young boys' boarding school. He felt it would help me with the next step in my education, social interaction, and independence. And did it help? I asked nonchalantly. Oh yes, but as you know, Agent Quince, the statistical possibility of a sexual predator working in a home for boys is greater than 82%. And who better to prey on than a boy who came from the streets, with no parents to check on his welfare, already emotionally distant? I don't think I was there for even a week before I was being called to Mr. Rowland's office, the head teacher. Cassidy admitted, slight tuckle in tow.
And what did he want?
Ruth asked naively. Blowjobs, mainly. At first, I got things in return. Sweets, money, stuff like that. And as I aged, pills, coke, booze. What, you didn't resist? I asked, surprised. What was the point? He knew I had no one to complain to. I was getting things in return as well, he answered, matter-of-factly. So, why did you kill him? I asked, remembering the contents of one of Cassidy's burial sites. His mouth curved into a sinister grin. Because I wanted to, he said, very coldly. A cold case investigation into the head teacher's murder unveiled circumstantial evidence that the head teacher had suspicions of Cassidy's past and was close to finding out his real identity. The investigator on that case didn't know what the dirt was, but after speaking to Cassidy today, it all makes sense now. So, had nothing to do with the fact he was digging into your past? I asked. One night he came into my dorm, middle of the night it was. Took me out and down to the boiler room. He tied me up and raped me. I could smell the booze on him. I didn't resist again, I didn't see the point. I just decided at that point I'd kill him, and so I did. The digging into my business came later. Went to his office, asking for at least some sort of payment for the midnight sodomy. He told me to get to fuck, in his broad Scottish accent, and threatened me that if I told anyone, he would wear me like a fucking glove. I must admit, even I laughed at that. But essentially, the detective who was looking into the death of my mother was coming around the boys' homes, homeless shelters, and juvenile detention centers in the surrounding states to try and find me. He showed my picture to the head teacher and asked if he'd see me. Well, thankfully, he didn't want to be outed as a pedophile that day, so he told the detective that he hadn't seen me. Cassidy told his story with such a whimsical tone, it was hard to remember he was talking about child abuse. We let him continue. There was no Google back then, so he couldn't just run my name or whatever it is people do these days. But I think a few months later, there were some missing posters flying around our area. I wasn't suspected of killing my mother. I was actually suspected of being abducted by the person who did, you see. Well, once Rowland saw that, well, it didn't take a genius, to be quite honest. The cold eyes, the mysterious background, the vacant stares as he forced himself inside me. I think he had his suspicions about me anyway. Once he had it figured, he came to me and told me he knew what I'd done and that he owned me from now on. No rewards, no quid pro quo, nothing. I'd be raped every night and there'd be nothing in it for me and nothing I could do about it. And well, when there's nothing in it for me, I decided things needed to come to an end, he said bluntly.
So this would be when you murdered him?
Ruth asked, coming back into the conversation. I let him do his thing every night, never resisting, waiting for the night that he got complacent and dropped his guard. The night he felt he didn't need the cuffs. One day I found a knife in his office when I was cleaning it, slipped it into my pants and took it down to the boiler room and hid it. I guess he was into hunting or something, I don't know. It wasn't like we spoke about hobbies or anything, so I'm just assuming. Anyway, on this fateful night, I waited until he had me on my knees. The dirty old fuck closed his eyes and tilted his head back in his usual expecting fashion. I slipped the knife out of its hiding place, very carefully, so quietly, not wanting him to notice. Cassidy was getting giddy as he got more into detail. Ruth and I just sat in silence. I aimed for the strip of flesh, right between his balls and his anus, and I fucking drilled it in. Oh my God, I ripped that sucker open. You should have seen his face. Priceless. I tore the blade up and down and up and down, like I was ringing a fucking church bell. Pulled that fucking thing clean off and let him bleed out, grabbing at the fleshy hole where his meat and veg used to be. Cassidy admitted, his teeth gleaming as he smiled. Thankfully, there was a furnace in the boiler room. I didn't even let him finish dying before I stuffed him in and turned it on. Hey, here's one for your research. Head teacher Roland was the first tongue that I ripped out with my teeth. Did you know that? Cassidy asked in an upbeat manner.
No, we didn't,
Ruth confirmed. Well, I wanted him to feel the pain, but not to be able to scream. I stomped on his neck and face a few times. It's so much easier to get a grip on the tongue once the jaw's been broken and some of the teeth have been removed. Anyway, it worked because while he was in the furnace, he moaned and groaned, but there was no volume. So I could just sit there and watch his eyes pop in his skull from the heat. Then I watched his skin begin to blister and bubble. I just sat back and watched. Well, maybe watched is the wrong word. Admired. I admired the flames. I remember feeling aroused with the power and control as I sat there. Oh, it completely made up for missing father's demise. You were aroused by watching a man burn alive? I asked, struggling to hide my disgust and disdain. Oh yes, Agent. I truly hope one day that I'll get to experience the thrill of watching the beautiful heat torching the withering skin of a writhing victim, Cassidy said, almost orgasmic as the fantasy formed in his mind. I scoffed at his comment, and his eye squinted. Something funny, Agent? He quizzed. Your days of hunting innocent people are over, Cassidy, so your little sick fantasies can remain simply that, I scorned him. Cassidy's eyes became dead, and they branded holes into me where I sat. Really think you shouldn't underestimate me. You can't keep what I am down forever. I cut Cassidy off at the knees. Keep what down? You really are a fucking deluded narcissist, aren't you? You think you're this never-before-seen malevolent force that nothing mortal can stop, but really, Robert, you're just a man, just like me. You seek out women who intimidate you with their success, and you destroy them and their lives and their families. There's nothing special about that. You're just like every other serial murderer in this prison, and every other prison across the entire planet. You know what? I've had enough of this shit for one day.
I've got another one of you sick fucks out there to catch," I scolded as I stood up and began to leave. Cassidy remained calm, despite my assassination of his personality, and he simply grinned. "Oh, it's always nice chatting, Agent Quince. Perhaps next time we'll be a little more up close and personal."
"If it's okay, I would like to stay and continue the interview,"
Ruth requested. "Knock yourself out. Here's a copy of the case file," I said, handing her a copy of Wichita PD's crime scene report on the Benson family massacre. "Get me something useful, please," I requested. She gave me a wink and said, "I'll see what I can do." "Call me when you're finished and I'll come pick you up." "Have fun," I told her as I hit the button on the door, letting the guards know I wanted to leave. We will, Agent. We will," Cassidy said, smarmy. I looked into his cold eyes and sinister grin as the door lock buzzed, snapped open, and a guard escorted me out. As I drove away from Florence prison, I began to curse myself for letting that psychotic asshole get under my skin. I'd removed Bodkins from the interviews for the same reason, and there I was getting irate over something much less. It was hypocrisy on legs. Well, the thing is, Cassidy just had a way of making you sick and losing your shit. S.A. James Rodriguez had a similar episode just after we arrested Cassidy. He spoke about the rape and murder of each of the victims in horrific detail without even a hint of remorse. The way he spoke about it was like he was some sort of artist refining his work. It just made you want to put a bullet in his head right there and then. I'd interviewed Cassidy before in regards to that incident in Kansas, where he was spotted by a witness. Well, he answered his question simply to brag about the awful things he'd done and throw a few taunts at the FBI too. I ended up losing my cool there as well, saying something similar to him. I pulled up at a highway diner and went inside to grab a coffee and a donut. Stereotype, I know. Well, anyway, I found out the case files and began to look at the case details, hoping an image of the man we were looking for would come to mind. It took a while, but a pattern soon emerged that seemed worth further study. Each family had attended church, yet there was no evidence of a religious motive to the crimes. Well, usually in crimes of such nature, the unsub will tend to leave Bibles at the scene, write the numbers of a verse on the wall in blood, and so on. I began to assess the geographical pattern of the murders. First murder, Texas. Second murder, Oklahoma. Third murder, Nebraska. Fourth murder, Kansas. The next logical place to look would be South Dakota. Each murder had taken place in the capital city. These couldn't be coincidences, surely. I started to get excited, but then suddenly deflated, realizing that there was only a pattern if we could count the Bensons. There's so much evidence this was another killer to our unsub, but I decided it was looking into, though, regardless. I picked up my cell and called Agent Bodkins. I waited for him to answer as I stared at the images of the murdered family. It was also at this point I realized I hadn't even received the background check on the Bensons. Useless. "Hey, Quincy, how you doing? You finished with Dr. Lecter yet?" he asked facetiously with a chuckle. "Oh, I have to apologize to you. Cassidy was talking about burning some pedophile teacher alive when he was a kid. Started saying he wants to do it again. Couldn't help remind him where the fuck he is. I stormed out," I said with an embarrassed scoff. "Now, let me guess. He blamed his crimes on this teacher copping a feel of his private area. Typical," Bodkins presumed. "Actually, no. He said he knew there was always something wrong with him. Hence why the only thing he felt when his father raped him on a daily basis was disrespect. Look, I'm not condoning his actions, Dave, but my lord, his upbringing was anything less than stable. How are we meant to stop evil when it keeps breeding it?" "No idea, Quince, no idea. Anyway, I'm sure you haven't called to mope about the twisted world of criminal psychology, so, what do you want me to do?" he asked positively. I smiled at his support and loyalty.
Well, seeing as I'm a total hypocrite, I have an important assignment for you, I informed him, eating humble pie. I'm all ears. So, let's assume that the murder in Wichita was actually the Showtime killer. Let's assume you're right and he did just change up his MO. Maybe he mixed up the states simply to throw us off. And with those assumptions, he will next target Pierre in South Dakota. The 3 murders that we categorically know were STK. All the families went to their local church. Maybe that's part of his victim selection. Get yourself down there and start going around all the churches and see what you can find, I instructed. What am I looking for when I get there? Well, ask the reverends if they've noticed any new parishioners in the last 2 weeks. White male in his 30s, strong build or signs of weight and combat training. Someone who's seemingly trying to converse or interact with families with 2 to 3 children. Sorry, I really don't have much else to go on, I confessed. Cassidy not give you anything worthwhile? Bodkins inquired. Not yet, Ruth's still with him. Maybe she'll have something when I pick her up. Look, I'll be in touch, keep me posted. I need to call Wichita. Sure thing, Quince. I'll head to the airport now, Bodkins said before he hung up. I pulled up the contact number for Deputy Miller. I called the number, then, after a long time had passed, the call was eventually picked up, and Jim Miller's youthful, 23-year-old virgin-style tone greeted me. Oh, howdy there, Agent Quince. Nice to speak to you again. How's the profile going? Any idea who the person is? He asked, the nervous ramblings of a green man who wasn't used to dealing with federal agents. Not yet. Like I said before, we're just conducting some research on similar offenders, and hopefully that can shed some light on him. Right now, I've got an agent heading to Pierre to make some inquiries. Maybe that'll bring something up, hopefully. Anyway, Jim, I'm calling because I requested the background check on the Bensons. Your desk sergeant said she'd get on with it, but never reached me. Oh, yeah, sorry. That's really not like her. Honestly, I did put it together for you, but I'm not sure why she wouldn't have sent it. I'll chase it up for you. Sorry, but what's the investigation got to do with Pierre? Okay, that's fine, but was there anything significant to report? I asked. The deputy scanned his mind. No, just usual. Good family. No history of abuse or violence. Sorry, he admitted. Still want me to send it? He asked. I sighed, not sure what the point would be. However, sometimes the devil is in the detail, and that's what being a special agent is all about. You know what? Send it anyway. Who knows what might jump out? I instructed the deputy. Sure thing, I'll chase it up tomorrow, he said. So, go on, you were saying something about Pierre, he asked, intrigued. Yeah, I've sent my partner to ask around the churches there. I think you should apply the same idea to your investigation. All the confirmed Showtime victims attended church. We think this could be where they catch his eye. So yeah, try and find out where the Benson went as a family in the last month, and maybe something will show up, I advised. Yeah, I get that. I just don't see what Pierre has to do with it, he said, confused. Well, each murder took place in the capital city of its respective state. First one in Austin, Texas. Second one in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Third one in Lincoln, Nebraska. So if we travel up in a straight line, then next up is Pierre, South Dakota. All victims were devout Christians, so our criminologist is certain this is a key part of the victim selection, but it's not a component of the murders themselves. Well, I felt I described the best I could to the deputy, but he didn't seem to take it in. But the other murder was in Wichita, not Lincoln. So that breaks open your pattern, doesn't it? Well, be honest, Jim. The more I look into it, the more I'm convinced it's a completely different killer. What makes you say that? The level of violence inflicted on the victim's prior to death. The way it just doesn't fit the pattern. No souvenirs taken. Different method on the children. I just don't see it, I confessed. But if this guy wasn't the Showtime killer, then that destroys your pattern. So maybe Pierre's a waste of time.
I couldn't help but see his point. But still, a possibility that had occurred to me earlier kept popping into my head. And then, suddenly, it hit me.
Holy shit,
I exclaimed.
What's wrong?
The deputy asked.
Well, let's say you're right.
If you were a killer, you were targeting different people in different states. Why would you miss out a state, or more specifically a town? I said, waiting for an answer.
I didn't get one,
so I answered for him.
Maybe it's a little too close to home.
The detective remained quiet while I went through the motions of my realization.
Or maybe he did do the Bensons, except they weren't strangers to him. He fucking knew them, and they fucking knew him.
What? I don't... The deputy couldn't keep up.
Listen, I'm gonna get on a flight to Kansas tonight. I need to come back to the house.
I can collect that report myself, and we can follow up on some leads. Can you meet me at the airport tonight?
Yeah, sure. Give me a call when your flight's leaving, and I'll be there with the car.
Slightly caught off guard.
Hey, sorry to throw this all on you, but
I think we could crack this deputy. I'll send my guy to Pierre, and me and you'll ask around Wichita. Not only could we prevent another murder, but we could find out who he is.
Oh my God. Amazing. Oh, okay, I'll see you tonight then.
The phone hung up, and immediately it rung again. It was Ruth. I answered.
Hey, Ruth,
you ready to go? I asked.
No, it's not that, but I think I may have something here, Quincy. I've built a decent rapport with Cassidy, and in return, he's given me some solid information. I showed him the police report on the Bensons, and as he flicked through, his eyes lit up. At what, I don't know, but he immediately clammed up and told me that unless I got him out of the hole, then he would take what he knew to his grave. I was wondering if you could call the warden and pull the Fed card,
she said with a nervous chuckle.
Ruth, Cassidy, he's a seriously dangerous man. I think he's where he belongs. I was just bluffing him with my office to make sure he cooperated. I really don't think he has anything concrete. I mean, how could he?
So was the Showtime killer. Imagine if back when Cassidy had only killed 3 people, someone told you they knew who he was, or they had a solid lead. Wouldn't you snatch that chance? He'll still be in a max security prison, under 23-hour lockdown. The person we're after is walking free, Quince. We need this. He's not going to make a mistake. He is going to get better and better.
I think he may already have made one,
I confessed.
What?
Ruth asked, shocked.
I think he did the Bensons, Ruth. And I think he did them because he knew them.
I think he did them out of rage and anger, rather than compulsion, because they knew who he is. The background report brought up nothing, though. Well, I'm heading to Wichita tonight to chase out the report on their background, because I haven't actually seen it yet, and I'll see what shakes loose. I'm meeting the deputy from the Wichita PD tonight, and we're going to go and do another scan of the house. I've sent Bodkins to Pierre, keeping with the potential geographical pattern, asking him to go visit the churches. We've got leads, Ruth, so maybe we don't need Cassidy's info.
That's great. I think we're on the right lines, but how long will those inquiries take? What if in that time another family dies? I saw the glint in his eyes. He's seen something in those pages, truly. He didn't bargain for yard time or petty privileges. He went straight for a ticket out of the hole. He has a royal flush. I know it, Quince.
She pleaded for my approval. Well, I'll admit it's hard to say no to someone who looks like she does, but regardless, she had a point. I didn't want any more bodies.
I'll give James a call.
He's the guy who caught Cassidy. He's on good terms with the DOJ. I'll explain things to him, and we can liaise with you then, okay?
Brilliant. Listen, I'll get a colleague from the university to pick me up. Don't worry. You just get yourself to Kansas. Let's bring this home,
she said excitedly. We said our goodbyes, and I immediately called James. It took a while to get hold of him. Not easy when you're planning one of the biggest surveillance operations this century. Eventually he got 5 minutes to himself and he answered. I told him as efficiently as I could about the developments in the case, or should I say the lack of developments. And I told him I needed a deal for Cassidy in return for his information. Well, James wasn't too bothered. To the best of his knowledge, Cassidy was on the wing he was bartering for anyway. He gave me a motivational speech and told me to go get my target. He'd take care of Cassidy and Ruth and commanded me to get to Wichita, as he agreed STK was likely from the area. I told him it was good to speak to him again, and he returned the sentiment. Well, the next call I made was to the desk of Wichita PD. This time a man answered the phone. I didn't recognize the voice, so I asked who I was speaking with. This is Deputy Desk Sergeant Evan Baston. How may I help you? He said. I see. Sorry, I spoke to Rosie Conwell yesterday, and I was cut off. She's not here, the man said bluntly. Well, any idea where she is? I asked, trying to hide my annoyance. No, but she's AWOL right now. AWOL? But I was kind of hoping she'd have a document for me. What document? Background report on the Benson family. Is it not on her desk? No, nothing here. I can chase it up when she's back in, he asked in a patronizing manner. No, it's fine. I have someone else on that for me, I said before putting the phone down. Prick, I said to no one in particular. I called the airport, booked a flight, and headed to the airport. On the plane, I mulled over everything I knew so far, and began to put the profile together in my head. Cassidy murdered women who reminded him of his neglectful mother. It pushed his buttons, and that's what drove his compulsion. Almost every serial killer in history, amongst other factors, suffered from some form of abuse, so perhaps the unsub came from a family like Cassidy's, where he was systematically abused. So he targets families that are perfect, because they remind him of what he didn't have. Where better to find perfect families than the local churches? Must be a big, strong man with some sort of training in combat or jiu-jitsu, based on the way he subdues the men. He has no issue breaking into a house with a grown adult male present, with the intention of defending his family's lives. And he finds his family, potentially at the church, and he stalks them, watches the house from the garden or the tree, finds a way into the house like an open window or something, assaults the children, luring the husband into the bedroom, subdues him, and then attacks the wife. He uses the children and husband as his audience to humiliate the wife as he rapes and then kills her. As he's leaving, he sees a happy family photo of them and takes it so he can look at them later, reliving the destruction he's caused. Well, I could imagine how the crimes had played out, but he just has no face, and that was frustrating. But maybe that was about to change. As the missing piece of the puzzle is the report on the Bensons, I just know it. There's something about that family that will crack this case wide open. I really don't think it's a coincidence that whatever it is being buried deep. I just needed to find out what that was. Maybe Cassidy's insight would shine a light on it. If not, maybe some detail in the report would point me in the right direction. The plane touched down in Dwight D. around 8 p.m. that evening. The weather was hot and the air was thick and muggy. I couldn't help but wince at the thought of all those children going to sleep with their windows open tonight. As I made my way into the arrivals lounge, I looked around for Deputy Meller, or at least a sign with my name on it. Nothing, though. I rolled my eyes once again at the police department in Wichita and left the airport. I was walking through the parking lot and towards the Enterprise across the freeway when a police cruiser suddenly ranged up beside me and the driver's side window came down. It was Deputy Meller, and he looked flustered and erratic. Agent Quince, I'm so sorry I'm late. It's been a crazy few hours. Bodies just turned up in Columbine Park. Half the force is there. It was hard to get away, and then I hit the traffic and every red light going, and you know the deal, he said apologetically. It's fine, honestly, I assured him, as I climbed into the passenger side. He waited until I had my seatbelt fastened, before he checked his mirror, flicked the indicator, and pulled out onto the freeway. "Where do you want to go first?" he asked. "The Benson place," I instructed. And Miller made a fair enough type of gesture with his head and mouth, and simply said, "On our way." Part 7. I took out my cell phone and turned it back on, hoping to have missed a call from either Ruth or Bodkins, but alas, nothing. Although I think their lack of phone signal was likely to blame for that, so I put the phone back in my pocket and took out the file on the Benson murder. I went over it for the 100th time as we slowly approached the house. The police radio crackled to life, and the dispatcher relayed the following message. "All units 10-6-7. We need urgent eyes on..." Deputy Mellor turned off the radio and breathed an annoyed sigh. "It's honestly been non-stop tonight. This body turning up has got all units focused in that area. They'll be radioing me to pick up the slack soon, no doubt. And I'll be honest, this little assignment with you is going to be such a relief. I know I can learn a lot from you, and you speak to me with more respect than any other in my department. So, let's give the Bensons everything we have, eh?" he said, looking over at me, smiling. I returned the sentiment. He did look like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, to be honest. I looked at the photos of the crime scene. The 3 photos of Mrs. Benson lying on the bed caused a hint of deeper thought, swearing that 4 had been snapped. Well, maybe just 1 came out faulty, which then made me think about Frank Adams and the fact that it may be better to have another set of eyes with us with this new line of thinking. "Is Frank Adams available?" I asked. "I think it's best we have an experienced crime scene photographer there, especially one who's attended all 4 STK murder sites. We can all redo the walkthrough under the new thinking," I added. "I mean, I can try and get in touch with him, but he's not from around here. He works in a lot of the neighboring states doing freelance photography, police, highway, insurance. So the chance I could get him up here on short notice is slim. Well, I'll try, though," he promised. "Go ahead, give him a call. But if not, I'm sure we'll cope," I said with a nod and a reassuring smile. Deputy Mellor seemed to appreciate my faith in his abilities. I could tell the feeling wasn't universal when it came to his colleagues. "I will do, when I get some goddamned signal," he said, frustrated, looking at the bars on his phone. "Is it normally like that around here, so close to an airport?" I asked, surprised. He nodded with half a grin. "You're in Kansas, Agent. Nothing works here," he quipped with a smile. We pulled up outside the Benson home around 9 p.m. I couldn't help but notice the exact same dark and dull setting of what's now the infamous murder house of the local area. The DeVille house was the same, and the Scott house, and the Clayton house. I held back a shiver. We climbed out the vehicle and both armed ourselves with 2 flashlights. We made our way into the house, and we both felt the eerie atmosphere. I imagine Deputy Mellor was experiencing this for the first time. I, however, had felt this in spades that night when I visited the Clayton house. I led us into the children's bedroom and immediately went to the window. I looked out into the yard. "Look, I knew it," I exclaimed, pointing into the garden. "What?" Mellor asked. "No trees, 9-foot fence, no signs of damage or climbing marks to the fence, but yet he knew how to get in. Maybe he didn't even come through the window. Maybe he came through the front fucking door. Yeah, they knew who he was. I'm certain now. That's why they're dead," I surmised. "Why so much violence? If they knew who he was, why not just kill them in their sleep, quick and quiet?" Mellor asked. I held back a chuckle at his inexperience. I really don't think they specifically knew he was the Showtime killer, but he had a grievance with them, I'm sure of it. So there was really nothing in that background report? No school reports on the kids with bruisings? No history of alcohol or drugs? Nothing that could help us? I asked, genuinely surprised. "Oh, you mean you never got that report?" Mellor asked, confused. "No, why? Should I have?" I asked, equally confused. "Yeah, I chased it up with Rosie earlier today, and she said she'd get straight on it," Mellor relayed. "I speculatively called the office not long after I spoke to you. Some other officer answered the phone called D.S. Evan Baston. Said she was AWOL. I told him. Mellor looked baffled. "I'll make some calls. It's honestly been crazy tonight. Maybe she's just out on a job. Out on a job? A desk sergeant? I asked, chuckling facetiously. Well, I don't know, do I? It's just not like her, that's all, Miller said, throwing his hands up. Gonna see if I can find her, and I'll get hold of Frank, too. Need to find some goddamn signal first, though. You okay for 5 minutes? Miller asked, pointing to his cell phone in his hand and rolling his eyes. I gave him a nod and a thumbs up. He smiled and left the house. While Miller was gone, I checked my own phone. Still no bars. Typical. Put it back in my pocket and decided to give myself a tour of the house. I sauntered through the aging halls of the tiny single-floor townhouse. I walked past a pantry and I don't know what made me do it, but I decided to take a look inside. I shone my torch in, and after squinting my eyes, I could tell there was a gap in the seam of the wall. I dug my fingers in and pulled it back. It was at this point I realized this pantry was actually a basement. I was a little taken aback, to be honest. Did they just miss it? Or had it already been searched? No photos taken, or even a mention of this in the crime scene report from Wichita PD. I aimed my torch down into the abyss and began to walk carefully down the steps into the darkness. Once at the bottom, I shone the light around, desperately looking for a light switch or cord. Nothing came across my path, though. You remember how I've mentioned the feeling I get when I walk into a house where a murder took place? The darkness, the eerie feel of knowing something terrible once happened there. Well, this basement had it in spades. Terrible things had happened down here, I could feel it. As I walked through the pitch black, the only thing visible being the small space on the floor that the torch illuminated, I felt a deep unease. I walked as far as I could go, and before I knew it, I came to another door. My heart sank when I realized that there was a deadbolt on the outside. I slid it back carefully and let the door swing open, which in the process let out a horrific creak that went straight through me and the rest of the house. Around 5 or 6 steps from this door led me down into another small room. No more than an 8-foot square space, if that. The first thing that my torch lit up was a mattress, and my heart began to pound a little quicker. The mattress was filthy, with signs of dry blood all over it. The next thing that lit up was a tripod. There was no camera, but if there was, it would have been aimed at the mattress. My heart was now seriously pounding. I was just about to turn around and run back up to fetch Jim when something caught my eye. In the corner, there were some markings on the wall. Some words had been carved into a section of the wall by the door. I got down onto my knees and took a closer look. This was when I realized they weren't words. They were names. Alan, Thomas, Frank, Robert, Evan, Tim, Riley, Rosie, Martin, David, Alicia, Beverly, Ashley, Michael. The cogs were moving once again, trying to process this huge piece of new information, when suddenly something pulled me out of my trance. It was my phone. I pulled it out of my pocket and looked at the screen. It was Ruth. I was a bit baffled as to why I didn't have a signal anywhere else but the basement, but I didn't give it too much thought. I answered it.
Hello, Quincy? Where are you? I've been trying to get a hold of you for hours.
Ruth said, flustered. Yeah, sorry, bad reception, I mustered, a little vacant, not totally with her.
The deal with Cassidy went through. The warden approved his transfer with a few conditions, but ultimately he told me what he knows. You really need to hear this,
she exclaimed, which perked me up a little. Hit me.
During my interview with Cassidy after you left, he told me about his life after the boys' home. He said that after the disappearance of the head teacher, the school was shut down and the students were all relocated or returned to foster care. Cassidy was sent to a foster family, and get this, in Wichita.
As Ruth spoke, I turned and looked at the word Robert amongst the 14 names carved into the wall. Let me guess. It was the Bensons, I asked, presumptuously.
Got it in one. And listen to this. He told me they were just as sick as his parents and the head teacher. Maybe even a little sicker, to be honest. He told me that on his first night in their care, the pair of them took him down to the secret basement to show him his place. Mr. Benson beat him, raped him, and left him down there in his own waste for nearly 2 days with nothing to eat but scraps. He told me the wife videotaped the whole thing. He said this happens to every child in their care, and he said he'd bet his life that the Showtime killer is one of the other foster children that was in their care. Now the thing I want to know is, we could have known all this without Cassidy had we just had the background report on the family. So where did it go?
Ruth, I think I know who the killer is. Mella told me the report was due to be sent to me by Rosie Conwell, the desk sergeant. I called her earlier today, and a man calling himself Evan Baston told me she's gone AWOL. Jim knew nothing about it and said it's not like her. I need you to call Wichita PD and tell them about Evan Baston and have him arrested. I'm in the Benson's basement now, and there's about 15 names carved into this wall. One of them is Cassidy's, and one of them is Evan. It's right next to Cassidy's. They must have been here around the same time.
Cassidy said there was a young boy who arrived shortly after he did. He said they went extra hard on this kid because he was weaker. They beat him harder, raped him multiple times a day, fed him his own waste, and locked him in that basement for days on end when they told the school he had a stomach bug. That sounds the sort of person who just might have an axe to grind. It makes perfect sense, too, why he killed the children with the bag from behind. He was ashamed to kill them because they went through the same thing as him, so he couldn't look at them while he did it. But ultimately, they were loose ends, and he needed to do it. He allowed them to see the Bensons be tortured, raped, and murdered. Then he killed them in the most humane way possible.
Ruth, we can go through the psychology of it all later. Right now, we have a killer to catch. I quipped, but still very serious.
I'll call Wichita now and find out about Evan
The call cut dead as Ruth spoke. I looked back at the screen to see once again no signal. I rolled my eyes, turned, and jogged carefully back out of the basement. As I got back into the main part of the house, I held my phone up into the air, desperately looking for a signal. As I ran around frantically, I hit a stiff form and I stumbled back. "Geez, what are you doing?" Jim Mella yelled as he tried to regain his balance. I apologized profusely. "I'm sorry, I just need to get some signal desperately. I need to borrow your phone," I rambled. "I have no signal either. I tried everywhere, nothing," he informed me. "Then your radio. Sorry, look, I know Rosie Conwell is either dead or in danger. The Showtime killer is the deputy desk sergeant," I proclaimed. "Evan Baston? Are you kidding?" Jim asked, shocked to his core. "Yes," I shouted. Jim gestured for me to calm down slightly. "I'll go radio it in now. Wait here," he instructed, running back out of the house to his car. I tried pacing around, searching for the signal, all the while trying to lower my blood pressure. All of a sudden, my phone found 2 bars from nowhere. Before I could even act on it, I received a notification that I had a voicemail. It was from Ruth. I went to call her back, but the signal disappeared just as quickly. Instead, I held the phone up to my ear and pressed play.
"Quincy? Oh my God, please answer your phone. I just got off the phone with a contact of mine at WPD. I asked them about Evan Baston. They've never heard of him. I got them to run a background check on the name, and Evan Baston changed his name at the age of 18 to James Malore. You're with the Showtime killer now. Don't let him know you know. I need you to hold on. There are units on the way to the Bensons. It's going to take a little longer, though, because they found Rosie Conwell gutted in Columbine Park. All the force are there searching the area, but they are on their way now. Just hold on, please."
The voicemail cut off, just as the butt of Jim Mella's pistol cracked the back of my head. I fell to my knees as I felt the blood begin to force its way out of the growing split in my skull and skin. turned to look him in the eye. I wanted him to see my defiance before he finished me. I wanted to tell him he wouldn't get away with this, knowing it was true. I pivoted on my knees and fell backwards onto my backside and looked up at the infamous Showtime killer. My eyes widened, despite the searing pain in the back of my skull. I couldn't help it, though. Frank Adams stared down at me with cold and hellish eyes. His face turned to anger and he suddenly turned, his mouth foaming, to look at Jim Miller. Did you fucking hear that? They're on their fucking way. I told you what you did would fuck us, but you just couldn't do as you're fucking told, could you? He yelled at him. You know they deserved it. You don't know what they did to me, Jim yelled back through stroppy tears at Frank. Frank simply raised his arm and pulled the trigger. Jim Miller's brains popped out of the back of his head, all over the Benson's living room wall. His body, almost like the World Trade Center, hung in suspension for a brief moment before it crumbled into a smoking heap. The suppressor meant that only Frank and I knew what had just gone down. Fucking moron, Frank said coldly. It all made so much sense now. They didn't need to be an intimidating man with serious combat experience. They didn't mind breaking into a house with a grown adult male, because there was two of them. At the risk of sounding like a total cliché, why, Frank? I asked, desperately trying to get him talking, buying time for the police to arrive. Frank scoffed. Why not? He dropped a duffel bag on the floor, and the clang of metal told me it was full of tools. Don't go anywhere, he said playfully, and gave a wink for good measure. He stormed out of the house. Moments later I heard a van door open up and then close. Frank Adams came stumbling back through the door, dragging a form behind him. My heart sank when I saw it was Bodkins. He threw his body down next to mine, and I immediately crawled over to him to check his pulse. I breathed a sigh of relief when I felt one. A shallow one, but it was there. Don't worry, he's not dead. I actually need both of you alive for what comes next, he said coldly. Opening up his duffel bag and pulling out a collection of tools, pliers, blades, and a hammer. What comes next then? I asked, again trying to stall for time. This is what happens when you have to adapt, because your fucking partner is a loose fucking cannon who doesn't know his fucking place. I take it killing the Bensons wasn't your idea then? I probed. No. As much as they fucking deserved everything they got, I held off because I knew their deaths would lead right back to me and James. But I really don't think you know what it's like, Agent. To have been told you're not good enough for your real parents. To then be abandoned into this ruthless world of child welfare. Because I assure you, there really is no bigger lottery than foster care. And let me tell you the fucking score. My numbers did not come up with the Bensons. Those animals beat me, starved me, invited their sick friends over while they all took turns raping me in their secret room. All the while the others watched and Mrs. Benson filmed it. She used to watch what they did to me, then take me upstairs, cover my bruises with makeup for when I went to school, and told me if I told anyone, they'd force things into my anus and leave them in there. I was fucking 12. What was I gonna do? I had 6 years of this shit. Then around 6 months before I was old enough to walk out of that door, 2 new boys came into the house. One of them was a kid called Robert Cassidy. I think we all know how that turned out, don't we? The other one was Evan Baston, he said, pointing to the floor where the bloody heap of Jim Miller and his brain matter lay motionless. You took them under your wing, I speculated. No, Robert was already very clearly damaged when he came to the Bensons. I don't think he screamed or cried once. They were weary of him, but ultimately, he was no fun for them. Evan, on the other hand, he cried like a baby after the first slap. They had him in that basement more times than I can remember. First night in there, he screamed the fucking house down. Neighbors might have actually heard something, if Mr. Benson hadn't already had the room soundproofed. Oh, the sick fucker. Well, don't play the victim. You two are just as fucking sick in my eyes. I spat the insult at him defiantly. He ignored my comment and continued his explanation. My time wasn't all abuse and degradation, though. When they got Evan, their new plaything, they left me alone in terms of raping, and they actually let me work the camera while they had their fun. Well, this way Mrs. Benson could have her turn too, you know. Not only gave me a break, but I became a very skilled cameraman. Ended up forming my career in more ways than one, I guess. Frank explained as he began to walk over to Bodkins with a knife. I raised my voice and stumbled to my feet in order to get his attention. So, why kill the other 3 families? What did they do wrong? My question made Frank turn his head and got his attention away from slicing open Bodkin's flesh. He placed down the knife on the floor and quickly pivoted around and stabbed me with the sole of his boot, driving me back down to the floor. He pulled some zip ties from the duffel bag and fastened my wrists behind my back. He then grabbed me by my Adam's apple and viciously pulled my face close to his. Well, they were what I should have had. What we all should have had. Well, you see, to supplement my income, I offered to take affordable yet professional family photos. I leave flyers around the local churches, grocery stores, community centers. I get all sorts of families asking to hire me. Mainly those families who pretend they're perfect, but you can tell there are cracks under the surface. And the husband with the wandering eye, the mother who loves the wine more than the baby, the hormonal teens running riot. Yeah, you know the kind. But there was the odd family that just didn't have anything to fault. Yeah, those devout Christian families with a faithful husband, trophy wife, obedient kids, saying grace at dinner, games night, annual vacations to Grandma's ranch in Minnesota, the works. Whenever I was around them, in their home, speaking to them, I'd feel my blood boil and my thoughts get more and more savage. Well, why couldn't my mom and dad love me like this, or why couldn't I have this family? Well, the thing about photography, especially home shoots, is that you have free run of the house. Oh, maybe we should take pictures in here, where the lighting is better. Such an easy way to find the best entry point for when you need to sneak in, Frank said with a sinister grin. So where does Jim, or should I say Evan, come into this? I asked, praying the police were nearby. It was obvious what he was going to do, murder me and Bodkins in the same manner as the Bensons, thereby framing Jim for the whole thing and portray himself as the hero. Turning up just too late to save the feds, but able to shoot dead the villain, and the only people who knew who he really was were right in this room, right now. After I left the Benson house, I kept in touch with Evan. I was much older, so I looked out for him, took him for ice cream, bought him his first beer, let him cry on my shoulder, you know. When the 8 rapes a day were getting a little too much for his gentle soul. Anyway, this one night he comes knocking on my door in the middle of the pouring rain, tells me he's run away and the Bensons are out looking for him. I took him in and hid him away from the Bensons and the authorities, and as soon as he turned 18, I told him to change his name and get a fresh start. Best thing for him, you see. I encouraged him to apply at the police academy to become a deputy as soon as he was old enough, because by this point, I was already a respected freelance photographer who was hired by a number of police departments, so I was a perfect character reference for him. So you manipulated him into helping you? I asked. Well, not at first. The night this all started was when I was living in Texas. Mrs. Clayton contacted me and asked me to come around to the family house, as they wanted a family photo. While I was taking photos, I spotted the fire escape window in the children's room. I spotted the tree overlooking the master bedroom. I began to get those nasty thoughts again, telling myself maybe it was time to act on those thoughts. Anyway, I did the shoot for her and her gorgeous family, he said, a clearly sadistic envy in his tone. I brought the photo over when it was finished, and she paid me in cash. No paper trail, you see. Next thing you know, it's a few nights later, I'm sat on the tree. I see the children open the window to let in some cool air. And I just think, fuck it, I'm gonna do it. My savage thoughts were no longer just thoughts. I'd already had a signal blocker set up in the garden, originally in case I was spotted stalking the house by a neighbor and they wanted to call the police. But as my thoughts escalated, I realized it would also stop the Claytons calling for help. I snuck through the window and ended up slipping. One of the kids woke up and started to cry and scream, so I just hit him with this rock I'd taken in with me. Then I hit the other one, too. The father came in just as I was coming down the hall, and me and him got into a brawl. I'm not a fighter, but I'm a blue belt in jiu-jitsu, and he wasn't a large man, and so eventually I was able to subdue him. Luckily for me, Mrs. Clayton, instead of running for help, tried to pull me off her husband. She was such a tiny thing. It was easy to subdue her as well. Before I knew it, a bit of furniture rearrangement, and moments later, I had an audience all lined up watching. Well, I took my time and my frustrations out on Mrs. Clayton. His explanation was cold and empty, yet all the while self-exploring. What were you thinking when you were raping Mrs. Clayton in front of her family? Did it excite you? By this point, I'd already guessed that Frank Adams was the psychopath of the two and that Jim was simply a follower. Frank Adams had the compulsion to kill innocent people to satisfy his rage. Jim simply took his rage out on those that had wronged him. Frank hadn't killed since the DeVilles. His rage must have been building, and I hoped he saw my questions as a chance for him to relive the experiences. Well, it was working. He was enjoying talking about it, but I just needed to keep him talking. I felt for once I was the one doing the humiliating, and I was the one ripping something innocent and perfect to pieces while others watched on and did nothing. The groans, the stifled screeches of pain, the muffled pleas from the husband for me to stop defiling his wife. I'd never felt power like it. I went from a helpless rape victim who couldn't even look a woman in the eyes to someone who strutted around like they were fucking God. All thanks to that one night in Austin. Hey, it always helped that I was hired by the state to be the crime scene photographer on scene, so I could easily point the investigation in the wrong way, he said with a crafty smile. I looked over at Jim's dead body. Frank saw it. After that first murder, I realized I'd made too many mistakes. Slipping, getting in a fight with a dad. Only by sheer luck that the mother tried to attack me rather than running for her life. I decided I needed a like-minded individual to help me carry out the next one. I needed someone who owed me, and who could easily be manipulated. Well, even if Robert Cassidy hadn't been outed as the Cross-Line Cannibal, I wouldn't have approached him. I didn't know where he was in the world at the time, and he just struck me as someone who couldn't be controlled, you know. But Evan, on the other hand, he was perfect. He was hesitant at first. He didn't like the thought of killing innocents, especially kids. But when I told him how it would make him feel, and I promised him I'd make sure we never got caught, he agreed to help me. So that's why you took the pictures. Not because they were souvenirs, but because they would have shown a commonality between the victims. That also explains why the next two murders were much cleaner. Because you had help, I asked. Well, both, to be honest. I also kept one photo that I took of the crime scenes, too. It was fucking great to be able to look at them happy, and then look at them broken. Like before and after, sort of thing. His sinister grin flashed at me as he began to walk over to Bodkins. When I had Evan helping me, everything was so much easier. Once we had a target, I'd hide in the garden. He'd knock on the door in his uniform and keep the husband busy, asking if he'd seen anything suspicious tonight. There'd been reports of a prowler in the area. Meanwhile, I'd sneak in, subdue the kids and wife quietly, and I'd make a noise on purpose. The husband would get spooked and invite Evan inside to assist him, and well, 2-on-1. Much, much easier, Frank said, making a shrugging gesture with his arms, his sick smile making me queasy. So, what happened here then? I probed. I'd guess at least 25 minutes had passed since the voicemail. The police had to be here soon. They had to be. Jim loved the feeling he had when he got to see the women be destroyed in front of him, as he'd held them down for me. For the first time in his life, it wasn't him. He loved it. Or maybe it's my fault, to be honest. At the Scott's house, on just his first try, I let him sodomize her with the bedpost after she was dead. He really liked that and always wanted to be the one to do it. He started begging me to let him rape the next one. Began to really get obsessed with doing it, begging me to let him take charge of the next one. Let him be the one to rape them. And that's all he spoke about. He wanted to do all those things to them before they died and a lot more other stuff as well. He told me he was ready to be the one in charge, but when the time came at the DeVilles, I tried to let him rape her, but the fucking pussy couldn't even get it up. She kept begging him not to hurt her, and he just melted. So I finished her. Then, after she was dead, he managed it fine, but he just couldn't hack it when they were still breathing. With this in mind, I told him he wasn't ready, and in fact, he had much more to learn before he got to take charge. Did he listen, though? No, he fucking didn't. Frank was furious, and he fired another silenced bullet into the torso of Jim Mellor. I don't know what set him off, but he just decided one night to come here, knock on the door, and inform them he was arresting them for allegations of abuse. Once he had him in cuffs, though, he went fucking crazy. He tore their genitals apart while they were alive. He tortured the shit out of them and hacked them up, big time. Still couldn't get it up, though. Had to use a fucking action man to rape Mr. Benson. Can you believe that shit? He let the children watch and actually had no intention of killing them. Couldn't make this shit up, could you? Anyway, after he'd finished, he called me bragging about what he'd done, thinking I'd be proud of him. I came down and went fucking apeshit. The trail, witnesses, he'd fucked us both. So I decided then that this mad dog needed to be put down. I told him what he'd done here tonight would end us, unless he did everything that I asked of him. He started crying and begging me to help him and telling me he'd do whatever needs to be done. So I made him snuff out the kids right there and then. Soft fuck couldn't even look him in the eye while he did it, Frank said with a disapproving shake of the head. So I fixed the scene. I marked the body of one of the kids so it looked like he snuck into the house through the window and used the kid to lure the husband in. Told him to bury the background check on the Bensons, and I steered all the police away from the basement. I had to slash their wrists so you couldn't see the bruising from the cuffs. I did everything I could, but I knew it was too late. Too many roads leading back to us now. So this was the only way out for me. Well, I'm truly sorry, Agent, but I need to carve you up like he did the Bensons. I'll tell him I came back to help you with your investigation and walking in on Evan hacking you both up. Managed to put a bullet in him before he got to me, but I got here just a fraction too late to save you both. The last bit, he exclaimed dramatically, as if reading the last line of a tense fiction story. He flicked his pupils over Bodkin's limp body and bit his lip with a true sadistic excitement. Don't worry, Agent Quince. I like an audience, so sit there and get ready, 'cause it's fucking showtime. His horrifying tone was cut short when he reached to pick up the knife and grabbed nothing but carpet. His pupils flicked to the side and spotted the new location of the knife. It was wrapped up tight in Bodkin's right fist. Bodkins, with whatever ounce of strength he had left, pushed himself upright and drove the knife into the calf of Frank Adams, and he flopped back down into his supine position. Adams screamed with all his might and fell back onto his backside. And I took this opportunity to act. I desperately flung myself onto the body of Frank, kicking my boots into his face. His fists were free, though. They weren't tied behind his back like mine, so he gave me a few stiff cracks to my already tender skull. I fell back, stunned, dizzy, brains absolutely scrambled. I shook off the pain as much as I could and looked up to see Frank about to cock his gun. With my last ounce of energy and desperation, I threw myself forward and kicked the knife's handle to the right as it still protruded from his leg. Frank bellowed out in pain as the heat boiled over in his leg to the point that he erupted in sheer agony. He stumbled back towards the door, but it wasn't enough. His wound wasn't life-threatening, he didn't drop the gun, and, most importantly, he was still standing. His expression was now pure anger and seething rage. As I crawled over to Bodkins, desperately trying to wake him in vain, Frank growled and he violently cocked back the slide of the gun. I held Bodkins upright in my arms as Frank raised his arm, pointing the gun at both of us, and aimed. The sound of gunfire, blood splattering and bone shattering, filled the air. My eyes remained tightly closed as I waited for the next bullet to shatter my head like it had done Bodkin's. I breathed in and awaited my fate. Then I wondered, why did I hear a bang, as Frank's gun had a suppressor?
Jesus, we need medics in here. I've got 2 men down, 2 injured.
A Wichita PD sheriff stood in the doorway, gun aimed at the space where Frank Adams had previously stood. Except now he wasn't there. I looked down to see Frank's vacant stare through glazy eyes looking at me. A 9mm exit wound sat just above his left eye. It all got a bit much at that point, as the adrenaline wore off, allowing me to feel the pain, and I must have passed out. The next few hours were a bit of a blur as I recovered from my injuries. I woke up 2 days later in St. Joseph Hospital to find Ruth and James at my bedside. I forced a smile through the horrific agony in my head.
"Hey guys,"
I managed. Then suddenly, a horrifying thought.
"Oh shit, Bodkins,"
I asked, concerned, beginning to stir and sit up, the pain getting worse.
"Whoa, come on, rest. That's an order,"
James said, pushing me back into my bed.
He's fine. He's in an induced coma, but the doctors are really positive. They'd stop the bleed on his brain and fix the hemorrhaging on his stomach. Just needs time to rest. He'll be awake in a few days,"
Ruth assured me as she stroked my arm. Well, that felt better than the morphine, quite frankly.
"What happened to him?"
I asked.
"A blood force trauma to the head and body, they believe.
Frank Adams must have already been in Pierre, South Dakota, waiting for his next victim. You, obviously not knowing Mellor's involvement at the time, informed him about Bodkins and his assignment. Looks like he called Frank and tipped him off.
Well, I made a few calls to South Dakota State Police, and they made inquiries of their own.
Bodkins was asking all around the churches and was close to finding the flyers, but he must have been ambushed by Adams before he did. He was violently assaulted, abducted, and brought to Kansas. He likely learned that you and Mellor would be together tonight, and he told him to bring you to the house. He will have told about Rosie Conwell having the background check on the Bensons and ordered Mellor to kill her. Jim dumped Rosie's body in Columbine Park, then called it in, just before he picked you up from the airport. Hence why a lot of the police were focused in that area. It was the death of one of their own, so he had them all worked up and focused in that one area. And that's why it took longer for them to get to you, but honestly, Quince, you kept your nerve so well. You kept him talking and bought yourself time. You should be extremely proud of yourself. You saved Bodkin's life and your own. The pride in James's voice was incredibly exponential, and I smiled.
"I'm just glad you're okay,"
Ruth said with a warm smile.
"Get well soon, Quince. I've got to get back to the office."
You'll be receiving a medal for your help in this investigation. I've seen to it with Deputy Director Ray, James informed me with a wink.
"I'll come back to see you tomorrow,"
Ruth assured me. She waited until James's back was turned and then kissed my forehead. Well, I immediately felt like $1 million and felt so much better watching her leave. Well, 1 month has passed, and in this time Bodkins and I were both given the all-clear and discharged from the hospital. We returned to active duty after a 2-week compulsory vacation period and a thorough physical and psychological assessment by an occupational health therapist. It turns out that the bites were made by Frank Adams, except he wore false dentures when committing the murders. He wore gloves, condoms, hairnets, the lot. While being an experienced CSI photographer, he was an expert in cleaning up DNA. If it wasn't for me, Ruth, Bodkins, and the murder of the Bensons, he probably would have never been caught. We were also both awarded a medal for valor whilst in the line of duty, and we're finally given the recognition we deserve from the higher-ups at Quantico. Ruth also told me the next time I was in Denver to give her a call and we'd get a coffee. Life was honestly going really great, up until literally last night. Around 9 p.m. last night, James contacted me in Bodkins, telling me to get saddled up and catch a flight to Texas. I was a little confused as to why he needed us down there. He He told me he'd explain when he got there, so we both raced to the airport and jumped on the first flight to San Antonio. We assumed we were being called in to assist on the Laredo trafficking surveillance operation, but as soon as we arrived and James gave us the address to meet him at, my heart sank into my stomach. It was the home address of Amy Edmonds, Robert Cassidy's ex-wife. There's no way this could be good. He was waiting for us at the door as we pulled up in our rental car. He filled us in on what had occurred over the last 24 hours. Cassidy had murdered a young guard who just started at the prison and stolen his uniform. He'd also ruthlessly ambushed Lieutenant Perkins in the staff toilets and killed him. He stabbed him 27 times, bit off half of his face, and stolen his key passes and radio. He'd caused a riot by raising a false alarm in one of the other wings with Perkins' radio. Then he'd stolen a nurse's car and left the area undetected. They found the car dumped near the Oklahoma state line and assumed he was heading to Texas to gain his revenge on Amy for her turning him in. And that brings us to where I am right now. Currently, Bodkins and I have taken Sadie Edmonds, Cassidy's biological daughter, to Amy and brought her to a safe house in Fort Worth. James is currently with Amy as I type this out. They're heading over to Denver to collect Ashley, the eldest daughter of Amy and her first husband, Jeff. James called me a couple of hours ago with an update, informing me that they believe that that's where Cassidy is heading, due to the fact that they've just found the tortured corpse of Jeff Benning, Ashley's father. Right now, Bodkins and I are sat, keeping ourselves entertained while we wait for the backup from Dallas PD to arrive. In this time, I've decided to type out this story from my memoirs, as the Showtime murders were really what made my career. Well, hopefully it was just the start of what will be a long and distinguished career with the FBI. Oh, well, I hope you've enjoyed this story, guys. But sorry, I have to wrap this up because it sounds like finally the Dallas cops are here. Well, what an ending, eh? So, it all comes around, whatever goes around, and whatever goes around comes around. I have to say this entire Robert Cassidy serial killer series, spanning several multi-hour videos, has pretty much been among the, if not the, most satisfying thing I've ever done on the channel, and I really, really hope you've enjoyed it just as much as I have. Well, thanks for sticking around, and more to come soon, but as you can imagine, I'm pretty emotionally exhausted after this effort. Brilliant story, but it's really taken it out of me. Thanks once again to A Clock Strikes 3 for her wonderful guest appearance on these last few videos. Okay guys, I'm done for the night. Back again very, very soon though, on Sunday with the finale of another series that's been ongoing for a couple of months. I'll let you know as and when. Well, that's enough for me for one evening. Till the next time, very, very sweet dreams and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.